Chapter 261. Is this your attitude? For most people at Hogwarts, the first part of the holidays was pure bliss. No classes, no professors watching their every move, no homework deadlines, just paradise. They could play chess in the common room until midnight, wander the grounds, have snowball fights, or lounge by the fire all day. Homework? That could wait until term started again. So on the last night before the Christmas break ended, the Hufflepuff common room looked like this. The earlier laughter and games had given way to silence and a tense, hurried industry. Everyone was bent over any flat surface, tables, chairs, windowsills, even the floor, trying to finish the work they'd ignored for weeks. Quills scraped across papers, ink bottles were passed along, and the occasional frustrated groan cut through the quiet. This ritual happened in every house once or twice a year. Edgar was leaned against the sofa by the fire, head buried in his work. He sat awkwardly, slumped against the armrest, pages spread across his lap, a quill gripped as if it were a tiny dagger. "The old bat's up to no good," he muttered between strokes, loud enough for a few nearby to hear. "Who is he trying to murder with all this homework? A 5-foot potions essay. Why doesn't he just write it himself? He must have nothing better to do than torment us." Not far off, Lynn flipped through a book at an unhurried pace. His space in front of him was empty. No papers in sight. When Edgar complained, Lynn looked up and said, "Calm down. Compared to Harry Potter's homework, yours is nothing. Harry's is the real killer." Edgar blinked. "Harry Potter?" he echoed. "Isn't he the champion? He still gets homework?" "Who told you champions don't get homework?" Lynn raised an eyebrow. Edgar froze. No one. I just figured, since they're so busy with the tournament, the professors would." "Would what?" Lynn cut in. "Exempt them? In your dreams." He set his book down and shifted to a more comfortable position. "I just have special permission from the professors to skip the basics. Harry doesn't. He can't dodge any of the homework he's supposed to do. And," Lynn's mouth quirks, "I heard from Fred, no, was it George? Snape assigned him an extra 5-foot potions essay." 5 feet? Edgar's eyes widened. "That's right, 5 feet. Just for him." Edgar stared at the pile in front of him, a 3-foot transfiguration essay, 2.5 feet of charms, and a foot each for herbology and history of magic, 7 or 8 feet in all. That was his total load. Harry alone had 10 feet of potions? Edgar's jaw worked. "Snape really hates him," he said finally. Lynn shrugged. Edgar went back to scribbling, but his spirits were lifted. Misery shared felt lighter. Night fell. Moonlight edged through the curtains, but no one was in a mood for the scenery. Less than a day before term, and too much unfinished work. So few went to the Great Hall for dinner that the Hufflepuff table looked nearly deserted. House elves could bring food from the kitchens, and many students grabbed something to eat on the run and kept writing. Later, the common room flames popped and crackled softly. Most of the students had retired to bed. Edgar lay on his mattress, only a few inches of ink separating him from completion. His hand was slick with sweat. Each stroke was weaker than the last. Then, a loud, unmistakable growl. Growl. His stomach sounded outrageously loud in the hush of the dormitory. Edgar froze, looked down, then around. William and Ollie were still absorbed in their work, not looking up. His gaze landed on Lynn, who was about to leave. Lynn had already put on his coat and was holding his wand, looking like he was heading out. "Lynn," Edgar's voice carried urgency. Lynn turned. "What?" Edgar pointed to his midsection, a flattering smile pasted on. "Bring me something to eat, please." Lynn looked him up and down. "You've got a nerve. Is that your attitude when asking a favor?" Edgar's smile faltered. Seeing Lynn's half-amused expression flooded him with a mix of emotions. Anger, helplessness, frustration, and sudden regret at the tone he'd used. Then his stomach growled again, louder this time. A battle raged between dignity and survival. Pride said, "Act like a Hufflepuff. Have some backbone." The survival instinct argued, "Can backbone be eaten?" Dignity fell silent. Survival won. Edgar took a breath and forced out through clenched teeth, "Thanks, Godfather." Lynn nodded, satisfied. "Wait here. Your godfather will be right back." He set off for the kitchens. At that hour, the corridors were mostly empty. Just outside the common room, Lynn bumped into someone familiar, Cedric, also heading to the kitchens, carrying an empty bag. He was clearly fetching food for someone. "Cedric," Lynn greeted. "Finished your homework yet?" Cedric smiled warily. Not yet. Still have the last 2 inches. He glanced at Lynn. You? Lynn shrugged. I don't have to write it. Cedric's eyes flicked to him. Then he nodded. Right, you have permission from the professors. They walked together. Who are you getting food for? Cedric asked. Edgar, Lynn said. His stomach was making a racket and he begged me. And you? Lynn asked. Who's your food for? Cedric shook the empty bag. Cho, she's been helping me with leads and research all week, so she hasn't had time for homework. Cho, Lynn raised a brow. Ravenclaws procrastinate too, apparently. But then you should definitely bring her something. They reached the kitchen entrance. Before they could touch the painting to tickle the pair, your standard passphrase to make it laugh, screams erupted from within. High, terrified shrieks from house elves. Lynn and Cedric froze. Their wands slid from their sleeves into their palms in the same instant. Without a word, they sidled to the door and flattened themselves against the wall, holding their breath. The house elves' screams were sharp and frantic. Cedric and Lynn exchanged a quick look. You open, I cover. Then, as Cedric reached toward the pair, Lynn's other hand shot up and a silent silencing charm struck the fruit with precise timing. The pair's mouth opened but didn't get a laugh out. A doorknob gleamed into being. Cedric didn't hesitate. He pulled the handle, and they both dove behind the door. Through the narrow crack came the hiss of 2 spells. Stupefy, shouted one voice. Stupefy, came the reply, almost immediately after. Chapter 262. Vomiting? Bang! No one could tell whose spell had hit its mark. The kitchen exploded into chaos. The clatter of falling pots and pans, the terrified cries of house elves, and the dull thud of something heavy toppling over all mixed together. Lynn and Cedric exchanged a quick look, and without hesitation, raised their wands, ready to keep firing. Ron! A scream came from deep in the kitchen, raw with panic. Both of them froze. Lynn's wand hung midair. Cedric stood rooted. They stared at each other, confusion mirrored in their faces. Lynn frowned and listened. That voice, it sounded familiar. Cedric, he whispered, doesn't that voice sound familiar? Cedric lowered his wand. It sounds like, he hesitated. Granger? He was already stepping forward, wand down, moving to go inside. Wait! Before Lynn could stop him, a blinding light shot out from the depths of the kitchen. Bombarda! The spell hurtled straight at Cedric's face. He didn't have time to dodge. Lynn reacted on instinct and stepped in front of him. There was a dull impact as the blasting curse slammed into his shield charm and rippled through the air. Lynn flicked his other hand and cast a muffliato, muffling the racket so it couldn't carry beyond the room. Slowly, the dust settled. The kitchen came into focus. House elves still screamed and scrambled, clutching their heads. Some cowered behind stoves, some crawled into cupboards, some lay flat, trembling. Pots and pans littered the floor, flour and seasonings were scattered everywhere, and several kettles still bubbled. Lynn didn't pay much attention to the chaos. He scanned the room and fixed on a slightly ajar cupboard door. Hermione, he called, not loudly but clear enough. It's me, Lynn. He waited. The cupboard opened a little more, and a head peeked out, eyes wide and tense. When Hermione saw Lynn, she visibly relaxed. Her shoulders dropped and the hand holding her wand fell. Lynn? Her voice was half disbelief. Is it really you? Lynn nodded. Hermione stepped out, brushed the dust from her robes, and walked over to them. She looked at Lynn, then at Cedric, a sheepish smile forming. Good evening, Lynn. Cedric. Good evening, Lynn replied. Cedric nodded as well and added dryly, Good evening. What are you doing in the kitchen? Hermione asked. Lynn shook the empty bag in his hand. Bringing food for Edgar. You? Hermione straightened proudly, produced a small box from her robe, and placed it on the table with gravity. Lynn and Cedric leaned in. The lid opened to reveal dozens of neatly arranged badges, black, white, red, yellow, even a few purple. On each badge were the same 4 letters, S-P-E-W. Lynn stared at the letters for a moment, then back at Hermione. Spew? He said, the confusion slipping into his voice. You're not planning to have the house elves use these to boo the champions from the other schools during the second task, are you? He actually paused to consider it. Although, Professor McGonagall wouldn't approve. It's an international event. Those sorts of tricks could cause complaints. Hermione's face froze. Her eyes widened and heat rose to her cheeks. It's not spew, she snapped, voice higher. It's SPW, the Society for the Promotion of Elfish Welfare. Oh, Lynn blinked. Spew, spew. They do sound very similar. Hermione took a steadying breath. Cedric watched, utterly baffled. He looked from Hermione to the badges, then to Lynn. How have I never heard of this? He asked. Lynn, have you? Lynn shook his head. Never. Hermione's chest swelled with pride. I founded it, she said, 2 months ago. 2 months, Cedric echoed. Yes. Hermione warmed to her topic, pushing the box forward for emphasis. The Society for the Promotion of Elfish Welfare, SPEW, is dedicated to fighting for the rights that house elves deserve. Cedric's confusion deepened. Deserved rights? Yes. Hermione nodded vigorously. House elves have been enslaved for ages. No pay, no holidays, no personal freedom. It's inhumane. It's contrary to everything a civilized society stands for. Her excitement built, and her words came faster. Think about it, Cedric. Hogwarts employs over 100 house elves who work day and night and never receive a single nut. They're not even allowed proper rest. That's exploitation. Cedric's mouth opened and closed without a word. Seem to what? Hermione cut in when he finally started. Seem happy. That's the result of conditioning. Years of servitude have eroded their self-awareness, so they accept being exploited as normal. That's what we must change. She drew a breath and launched into a longer speech. SPW exists to first, make sure house elves receive fair wages and benefits. Second, guarantee them rest. Her voice rolled on, earnest and rapid. Lynn stood with a polite smile, but his attention drifted. His eyes slid past Hermione's fervent face to the far corner of the kitchen where several house elves huddled, watching them with terrified expressions. Wages, one of the elves whispered in shock. Duo doesn't want to live anymore. Equality, another nearly dropped the pot she was holding. Lulu is a bad elf. Lynn's lip twitched. Hermione continued, oblivious to the hushed panic. We believe the Ministry of Magic should introduce laws to regulate the use of house elves. Existing law is a vacuum. This is a serious legislative oversight. Her words kept coming, earnest and uncompromising. Lynn's left ear began to tune her out automatically. Thoughts of Edgar filled his head, his godson waiting in the dormitory, hungry. Hermione's speech receded into background noise. The words reached him, but made no impression. So we must spread awareness across the school and recruit more members to SPW. When she finally paused to breathe, Hermione looked expectantly at Lynn and Cedric. Would you like to join? Lynn blinked, refocused. He glanced at the box of badges and at the eager set of her shoulders. He hesitated, then chose honesty. I don't think I'm suited for it. Hermione was taken aback. Why not? Lynn pointed toward the huddled elves. I don't think they're interested in being liberated. Hermione followed his gesture. The elves immediately pressed faces into their hands, trying to disappear. Hermione drew a breath. That's just temporary, she said. Once they know their rights, they'll change. Lynn nodded and said nothing more. He picked up the empty bag and moved toward the stoves. I'll get Edgar his food first. Hermione turned to Cedric. And you? Cedric gave an awkward smile. I need to get food for Cho. She's still rushing to finish her homework. Hermione watched them walk away and shook her head. You'll understand one day, she called after them. Lynn waved without turning. As they left the kitchen, Hermione was still talking to the elves. You don't need to be afraid. I'm here to help you. A chorus of terrified squeals answered her. Lynn and Cedric exchanged a look. Do you think she'll succeed? Cedric asked. Lynn thought a moment. Unlikely. They continued on, footsteps echoing down the corridor as Hermione's earnest voice and the house elves' wailing faded behind them. Did we forget something? Cedric asked. Maybe, Lynn said. Anyway, my godson must be starving. Let's go. Chapter 263. Mermaid, are you tired of living? Once Christmas was over, the second task loomed just around the corner. The date on the calendar crept closer day by day, and the champions were on edge. Lynn often saw students from other schools clutching golden eggs during breaks, their brows furrowed as they studied them again and again. Especially the three Hogwarts champions, Cedric, Harry, and Roger. They might as well have been surgically attached to those eggs. They held them while eating, while walking, even sneaking glances during class. Professor McGonagall had confiscated them twice already, returning them only because of the boys' status as champions. The sight made the three Durmstrang champions seethe. Crumb looked at Cedric's egg every day with an expression so complicated it might have been directed at a murderer. Louis, meanwhile, wore nothing but envy, glancing in Lynn's direction whenever he thought no one was watching. Katya avoided looking at the eggs at all. Whenever she saw Lynn, she took a circuitous route to avoid him. But the egg problem had to be solved. Lynn learned from Fred and George Weasley that the Durmstrang champions were quietly asking around to buy golden eggs from other schools. "You should have seen it," Fred said, imitating them with a grin. Crumb's face basically screamed, "I want to buy an egg." George added, "Louis even asked if anyone at Hogwarts would sell, said the price is negotiable." Lynn's eyes lit up. He fell silent for 2 seconds, then a smile spread across his face. A smile that made Edgar, watching nearby, shiver. "What are you planning?" Edgar asked warily. Lynn patted his shoulder with mock feeling. "Nothing. Just feels like another sucker's wandered into my clutches." Edgar said nothing. Lynn moved fast. That afternoon, through Fred and George, he sent a message to the Durmstrang side. "Want to buy a golden egg? Sure. 100 galleons apiece." Less than an hour later, Louis came in person. 100 galleons? Louis's eyes widened. Surprise, suspicion, and carefully restrained eagerness warred across his face. Lynn nodded with the most sincere expression he could muster. "Yes, 100 galleons each. Fair price." Louis hesitated. "If I buy 3, is there a discount?" Lynn thought a moment and shook his head. "Nope, 100 each. 3 is 300. Fixed price." Louis ground his teeth, studied Lynn's solemn face, and finally nodded. "Deal." Lynn's grin deepened. He produced 3 golden eggs from his pocket and set them on the table. "Inspect the merchandise." Louis picked them up, turned them over in his hands. They were exactly like the eggs used in the first task. Smooth surface, solid weight, the faint seam running around them. Satisfied, he produced a pouch of galleons, counted out 300, and pushed it toward Lynn. "Payment." Lynn weighed the coins in his hand and smiled even wider. Louis held the 3 eggs, his hands trembling. "Lynn," he said, genuinely grateful. "Thank you." "No need." Lynn waved the thanks away. "It's what I do." After Louis left, Lynn stared at the 300 galleons in his palm, grinning from ear to ear. A few days later, on a Tuesday morning, Hagrid issued a notice for care of magical creatures. This week's lesson would be for all 4 houses together. The deans were to tell their students to meet at the main gates to be escorted to a different teaching location. Bundled in thick cloaks and stamping their feet to stay warm, the students waited in the entrance hall until Hagrid arrived and led them out into the snow. The wind cut like knives and the snow crunched underfoot. After a 10-minute walk, they stopped at the edge of the Black Lake. More than half the lake had frozen over. Its icy surface reflected the gray sky like a slab of metal. The Durmstrang ship still lay anchored in the center, a ring of ice clinging to its hull as if it had been frozen in place. Hagrid planted himself on the shore, turned to the shivering crowd, and boomed, "All right, today I'm teaching you about merpeople." The students buzzed. Whether from wizarding or muggle families, they'd all grown up on stories about mermaids, golden-haired, blue-eyed beauties who sang sailors to their doom. The illustrations in fairy tales had spoiled them. Many of the boys' eyes brightened. "I've always wanted to see them," a Hufflepuff girl whispered. A Gryffindor boy beside her murmured, "I hear they sing lovely." Lynn watched flatly. He'd seen merpeople in pictures in the library, and those images were a long way from the fairy tale versions. Hagrid, encouraged by the interest, blew a long, piercing whistle toward the lake. It echoed and rippled across the ice. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the surface cracked in several places and heads broke through the water. The students fell silent. When the creatures rose fully from the lake, the quiet held for 3 full seconds. Then voices rose in a shocked chorus. "These are merpeople." They were fish-like, yes, but not at all the picture book sort. Their skin was iron gray and rough as sandpaper. Hair, it clung to their scalps in clumps like dark green seaweed. Their eyes were cloudy and set far apart, their teeth jagged and stained a yellow-green with gaps where teeth were missing. The faces were flattened and expressionless. Together with the iron-gray skin, the creatures looked like something out of a horror story. Beautiful they were not. Lynn, unable to help himself, nicknamed them in his head Fukushima Specialty Mutant Fish. The students fell into stunned quiet. Hermione opened her mouth as if to say something but found no words. Ron's expression slid from eager to horrified in seconds. Malfoy was blunt. He pointed at them and shouted to Hagrid, "Are you sure those are merpeople? They're hideous." The merpeople stared at him, chattering in gurgles. Lynn was too far to catch everything, but he heard enough. "What's that white-haired boy saying? Is he mocking our looks? Does he want to die?" Their leader made a sharp, rattling sound and turned to the others. Lynn heard the translation clearly. "He says we are ugly. Decide what to do." Their expressions changed in an instant. They plunged their hands into the water, and several spheres of water coalesced out of the lake and flew through the air like thrown stones, aiming straight for Malfoy's head. He yelped and scrambled to dodge, but misjudged his escape. Instead of running for clear ground, he dove frantically next to Harry. "Potter, protect me," he cried, grabbing at him. Harry was pulled off balance, bewildered. "Malfoy, if you're going to dodge, dodge! Don't pull me!" he snapped. The water spheres rained down. Hagrid lunged and spread his massive arms to shield students, but his size only made him a bigger target. The merpeople hammered at him too. "Stop! Stop!" Hagrid bellowed. "It's a misunderstanding." In the chaos, Harry's hand slipped. He flailed, trying to catch something, and the golden egg he'd been clutching flew from his grip. "No!" he shouted. The egg traced an arc through the air just as one of the water spheres struck it dead center. The sphere burst on the egg's surface and sent a spray of freezing lake water everywhere. For an instant, everything was white with splashed water, and then the egg flared, exploding into a brilliant, dazzling light. Chapter 264, Feeling Frustrated. After the blinding flash, a soft click rang out. It was small, but everyone nearby heard it clearly. Under the crowd's watchful eyes, the egg split cleanly along a hairline crack. The two halves fell apart, revealing what was inside. Nestled in the center was a palm-sized statuette. The material was hard to place, white like some kind of stone, yet as if it were condensed moonlight. What drew everyone's attention, though, was its shape. It was a little merperson. Iron-gray skin, messy green hair, buck teeth, and bulging eyes, exactly like the ones from the Black Lake. For a beat, the great lawn went utterly silent. Then the statuette moved. Its mouth opened, and it began to sing, spitting out ethereal chanting that sounded as if it came from underwater or from a great distance, oddly melodic and alien. "Your treasure has been lost. We know where it is hidden." The song echoed over the Black Lake. The merpeople in the water stopped mid-motion. They turned their heads to stare at the still chanting figure on the grass, a puzzled look flashing across their faces before they looked at one another in confusion. "This is the chieftain's voice." "Yes, the chieftain." They gurgled back and forth, a mixture of surprise and recognition in their sounds. Malfoy, still drenched and snagged sideways from dodging spells, stood dripping and miserable, hair plastered to his forehead. He didn't seem to care about his soaked state. His eyes were fixed on Harry, and he wore an expression that was almost smug. "Oi, Potter," he drawled. "So the egg opens if you soak it? After all that studying, you didn't even know that?" Harry didn't reply. He stared at the chanting statuette, his mind stalling. The way to open the egg, was it really that simple? Just water? Just dunk it and it opens? He thought of the nights of work, the ruined copies of notes, the 2 eggs they'd wrecked, and begging Lynn to fix them. What had it all been for? He thought of the long, sleepless hours poring over books. His eyes drifted to the crowd and found Lynn standing at the edge, hands in his pockets. Lynn's face betrayed no surprise at all. If anything, he looked like someone who had known the secret all along. Harry held his gaze for 2 seconds. Lynn read him and shrugged. "You didn't ask." In that moment, Harry understood why Lynn had been so willing to sell 3 eggs so cheaply. Malfoy kept taunting from beside him. "Potter, Potter? Cat got your tongue? Have you finally realized how stupid you are?" Harry turned his head and shot him a look. "What did you say?" he asked. Malfoy opened his mouth, but Hagrid's booming voice cut him off. All right, stop arguing." He flung his arms out and pushed back the merpeople who were still fidgeting and eager to slosh more water. "This was an accident, not intentional." The merpeople gurgled a few protesting notes, but with much spluttering and reluctance, they slid back under the water. By midday, the great hall simmered with people. The 4 house tables were packed. The room smelled of hot food and 100 different conversations. Eating, however, was only a backdrop. Gossip was the main course. News that the egg had been opened had flown around Hogwarts like a charm. People clustered in groups and spun the story into new forms. Have you heard? Potter's egg opened. How did it open? A water ball hit it. By the Black Lake, the merpeople were pelting Malfoy and Harry got caught in the middle. The egg fell in and poof, it opened. That's simple? It's really that simple. There's a little merperson statuette inside, and it sings. What does it sing? I don't speak Mermish. How would I know? Whatever it said, it's definitely related to the tournament. At the Gryffindor table, a fourth-year boy cleared his throat and tried to imitate the statuette's chant at the top of his lungs. Woohoo! It was thin, off-key, and sounded more like a pig squealing than anything melodic. The table exploded with laughter. Another boy joined in with an even more tragic take. Soon half the hall was butchering the chant, turning it into nonsense. You have such high-speed rotating alchemy entering Hogwarts. Remember the formula I gave when I was young. Pasta must be stirred with number 42 concrete because the length of this screw will directly affect the torque of the excavator. Clearly, whatever language mastery did to Mermish made it sound absurd to human ears. Where there is laughter, there is also anger. The three Durmstrang champions, who had just spent a fortune buying 3 eggs from Lynn a few days earlier, felt ridiculous. They had finally learned the right way to open the egg and were planning to parade their knowledge before the champions of the other schools. And now the clue they had paid 300 galleons for was suddenly common knowledge. They wanted to storm Lynn's table, demanding refunds, but dared not. So they did the next best thing. They seethed silently. With February's arrival, the school's mood heated. 3 months had dragged without much happening, not for the champions, who had been holed up studying the eggs and barely sleeping, but for ordinary students it had been boredom after boredom. No matches, no tasks, just an avalanche of homework. That kind of stagnation breeds restlessness. By the time February came around, students were almost giddy, as if it were a holiday. Conversations in the corridors grew louder, gossip in the great halls sped up, even Peeves was in especially devilish form. Most tellingly, the guesses about the next task became increasingly outrageous. On one morning in early February, a bespectacled Ravenclaw set down what he'd been holding and announced with conviction, "I heard the tournament requires the champions to fight 2 water dragons." "Water dragons?" someone repeated. "Yes, dragons that live in the deep, even meaner than fire dragons." He pushed his glasses up and nodded solemnly. "Whoever can kill the water dragons passes." "That simple?" a Hufflepuff girl asked. "Well, that's the point. They're champions, right? They should have the skills." That version floated around for 3 days before being replaced by an even wilder rumor. "No way it's that easy," a Gryffindor chimed in. "I heard the champions have to dive 10,000 meters into the Atlantic with no equipment and kill a sea monster." 10,000 meters? The listeners shuddered. That's the Triwizard Tournament. If it were easy, what would be the point? This one spread faster, probably because 10,000 meters and sea monster sounded appropriately dramatic. Then a third tale surfaced. "No, no, no," a Ravenclaw girl returning from the library whispered, eyes wide. "It's a triathlon." "A triathlon?" "Yeah. Start at Hogwarts, swim across the English Channel, cross the Pyrenees to Beauxbatons, then swim across to Hokkaido to get to Durmstrang." A stunned silence followed. "Hokkaido?" someone repeated. "Isn't Hokkaido in Japan? Durmstrang is in Europe. Hokkaido is in Asia. You'd have to cross a whole continent and an ocean." "That's why it's a triathlon," the Ravenclaw shrugged. It wasn't just outrageous anymore. It was a geographic catastrophe. Swimming from Hogwarts across the Channel would take you toward France. Crossing the Pyrenees heads into Spain. Then going to Hokkaido would involve crossing most of Eurasia and a second sea. The version was so absurd that it won a few believers purely on principle. The Ministry could do anything, so why not this? Rumors only grew wilder. Lynn thought it fortunate he wasn't one of the task designers. If the tasks were planned by people who believed these stories, the champions would have no chance. Slay a sea monster, kill 2 water dragons, swim to Hokkaido. That wouldn't be a tournament, it'd be murder. Days ticked by amid mounting speculation. February 17th, the 20th, the 23rd. The calendar dates edged closer, and the school's tension rose. Whispered guesses turned into loud debates, and the gossip in the Great Hall became betting. Someone had quietly opened a ledger and started placing wagers on which champion would win. Rumor had it that the favorite, the one with the lowest odds, wasn't Crumb or Cedric, but Lynn. After all, his last task performance was outrageous, the Weasley twins explained to anyone who asked. Too many people are betting on him, so his odds had to be lowered. Soon the day arrived, February 24th. Competition day. Lynn slept late. When he finally opened his eyes, the dormitory was already empty. Edgar's bed was a mess, the quilt crumpled at the foot, William's was neatly made, the pillow precisely in place, Ollie's bed was smooth and empty, sheets unwrinkled. Sunlight slipped through the curtains and painted pale bands on the floor. Lynn lay staring at the ceiling a moment, yawned, and slowly sat up. He dressed, washed, tidied his hair. By the time he left the dorm, it was past 9. The corridor was deserted. When he pushed into the Great Hall, a wave of noise hit him. Long tables packed with students, every seat at the 4 house tables taken, the visiting delegations from Beauxbaton, Durmstrang, Ilvermorny, Ouagadougou, and Castello Bruxo filling the rest. Voices merged into a buzz, debates over which champion would win, speculation about the second task, and betting. A few Gryffindors clustered around a jar, tossing galleons in. Lynn scanned the room for Edgar and the others, but didn't see them. He threaded through the crowd and found an empty spot at the Hufflepuff table. Justin Finch-Fletchley sat beside him, spreading jam on his bread. When he noticed Lynn, his face lit up. "Lynn, you made it!" Lynn nodded and looked around. "Where are Edgar and the others?" "I don't see them." Justin swallowed a bite, wiped his lips. "Professor Sprout called them away this morning, Edgar and Neville from Gryffindor." "Professor Sprout? Greenhouse?" Lynn frowned. "Something went wrong in the greenhouse," Justin said. "She didn't say what exactly." Lynn fell quiet. If the greenhouse needed help, calling Neville made sense. His herbology was solid. Calling William was also reasonable. He was dependable. Calling Ollie was understandable, quiet, methodical. But Edgar? Lynn didn't look down on Edgar, but his herbology was barely passable. Asking him to handle a greenhouse emergency seemed as sensible as asking a troll to do embroidery, unless the problem involved heavy lifting. He decided not to press it. A plate was set in front of him. Steam rose from a pile of snacks, everything he usually liked. Justin beamed. "I went down to the kitchens this morning and asked the house elves to make these, all your favorites." Before Justin finished, more classmates crowded in. One hand rested on his shoulder and began to knead. Another reached for his leg. Lynn froze and turned his head. On his left was Hannah Abbott, on his right, Ernie Macmillan. Behind him, several Hufflepuff girls hovered, all smiles and looks of devotion. Susan stood close by with a copy of the Daily Prophet, reciting the recent movements of the other champions. "Crumb hasn't come down from the Durmstrang ship for days. Supposedly, he's isolating to study tactics. Fleur walks by the Black Lake every evening to get used to the place. Cedric and Cho." "What are you lot doing?" Lynn exclaimed. Hannah folded the paper away, earnest. "We just want you to relax." "Right," Ernie said. "Pre-match nerves are normal. We're helping you unwind." Lynn took a breath. "This is making me nervous. If there's something you want to say it. If it's about money, I've got plenty." They glanced at one another. Hannah's voice wavered. "Well, Lynn," she admitted, "I've bet all my pocket money for the semester on you." Lynn was speechless. Hannah's face flushed, but she pushed on. "Fred and George set up a betting booth, and I put my bets on you." Heads around the table nodded emphatically. "Me too. Me too. Me too. I wagered all the galleons I saved this year." Lynn stared at the expectant faces, not sure what to say. After a beat, he smiled in resignation. "So you brought food and gave me massages because you're afraid I'll lose?" Hannah nodded earnestly. Lynn sighed. "Okay, I'll take the food, but no more massages. Don't worry, I'll do my best not to lose." Relief washed over the table. Lynn picked up one of the pastries and bit into it. The house elves had outdone themselves. It was delicious. Hufflepuff wasn't the only house with money on the line. Over at Gryffindor, Ron was holding a frantic pep talk for Harry. "Harry, you absolutely have to win," he insisted, hands on Harry's shoulders, eyes wide as if the outcome were life and death. Harry looked more bewildered than reassured. Ron leaned close in a lowered voice. Your odds are pretty long. Do you know what that means? It means no one expects you to win. Thanks, Harry muttered. You're welcome. Ron missed the note in Harry's voice. If you win, it'll be a big payoff. I'll give you half what I make. Harry frowned, looking at Ron's face, which practically screamed, I'm going to get rich, and then said seriously, Ron, take my advice. What? Bet on Lynn. Ron blinked, looked from Harry to Lynn and back, and shook his head. No, I'm betting on you. You're my friend. Who else would I bet on? Harry opened his mouth and found no argument. Ron started rummaging in his pockets and produced a small pile of coins, 1 sickle and 7 nuts, which he shoved into Ginny's hand. She looked at him, baffled. What are you doing? Place the bet for me, Ron said. Ginny peered at the few coins. Why don't you go to Fred and George yourself? Ron made a dismissive face. You wouldn't understand. If I bet and lose, do you think they'll be merciful? Ginny sighed, staring at the coins that didn't even total a galleon, then at Ron's earnest expression. Even 1 newt is money, Ron snapped. Ginny put the coins in her pocket. Fine, I'll place it. At that moment, the Great Hall doors swung open. Professor McGonagall entered, followed by Neville, Edgar, William, and Ollie. She paused at the threshold and swept the room with a look. Champions, follow me. The rest of you, gather by the Black Lake. Lynn stood and moved forward with the others. As he passed Edgar, his steps faltered. Behind, Edgar's face was a tangle of emotions, guilt mixed with an odd excitement. William pushed up his glasses and gave Lynn a nod. Ollie remained unreadable, as always. Edgar, however, was different. Lynn had roomed with these 3 for years. He could read them at a glance. When Edgar pulled that particular expression, Lynn could tell he'd done something embarrassing and felt bad about it. Lynn narrowed his eyes, about to ask, when McGonagall's voice called ahead. Let's be off. Ludo must be getting impatient. The champions followed Professor McGonagall and soon arrived at the shore of the Black Lake. The scene there was unlike anything the students usually saw. Near the water, a huge tent stood alone, wrapped in a thick fog. Go on in, Professor McGonagall said. Ludo is waiting inside. Lynn pulled back the flap and was the first to enter. Inside, the tent was far larger than it looked from the outside. An undetectable extension charm had been used. A massive long table filled the center, though there was no map this time. A few chairs were scattered about, and several devices that looked like underwater breathing apparatuses leaned against the walls. Ludo Bagman stood by the table. Hearing the flap, he looked up and a brilliant smile spread across his face. Here they are, he cried. Come in, we were just waiting for you. The champions took their places. Ludo opened his mouth to speak. Wait a moment. Chloe from Beauxbatons interrupted. Ludo's smile faltered. What's the matter? He asked. Chloe glanced around and frowned. Fleur isn't here yet. There was a beat of silence. Ludo's gaze swept over the Beauxbatons group. Only Chloe and Sophie stood there. Not here yet? He repeated, clearly puzzled. Wasn't the meeting set for 9:30? No one answered. Ludo started to speak again when the tent flap opened once more. Madame Maxime's tall figure filled the entrance, and Fleur followed behind her, looking pale and drawn. She slid in silently and went straight to stand by Chloe and Sophie. Madame Maxime offered Ludo an apologetic look. Ludo caught the signal, wisely said nothing, and turned back to the champions. All right, he said. Now that everyone is here, it's time to go over the specifics of the second task. The second task will take place at the bottom of the Black Lake. His eyes skimmed the gathered champions. I assume you all learned this from the 20 and have prepared accordingly. The champions nodded. It would have been unreasonable to be surprised. The secret of the 20 had already spread through the school. Ludo nodded with satisfaction and continued. You will go to the Black Lake in a moment. Each champion will enter the water separately from different directions. He paused, his tone dropping a touch. Entry time will be determined by your score in the first task. The champions exchanged looks. The Durmstrang contingent looked particularly grim. The first task scores were plain as day. Lynn 80, Beauxbatons 35, Hogwarts 45, Castello-Bruxo 38, Ouagadougou 54, Ilvermorny 58, Durmstrang 10. Durmstrang was last by a mile. That meant Krum, Louis, and Katya would be the very last champions to enter the water. Even setting aside the outlier Lynn, Ilvermorny's 58 would buy a huge head start. Ludo didn't dwell on how much time each point bought. only that it wasn't trivial. By the time some champions entered, others might already be hundreds of meters away. Ludo pretended not to notice the shifting expressions and went on, cheerily. And now, the content of the competition. He faced the champions. What you need to do is retrieve your treasures. He smiled and said it plainly. That is, your Yule Ball partners. They were sent into the Black Lake by the 22s early this morning. The tent fell silent for a second. Every eye swung toward Lynn and Fleur. If both of them were here now, who were they supposed to rescue? Ludo seemed to have anticipated the question. Since both of those champions are participating, after discussion the tournament committee made reasonable substitutions for their treasures. He looked at Fleur. Miss Delacour's treasure is her sister, Miss Gabrielle Delacour. She is at the bottom of the lake right now. Fleur's face turned even worse, but she said nothing. Ludo then looked at Lynn. And Mr. Lynn's treasure, he paused, then added, is your 19? Lynn stared, incredulous. Ludo nodded as if confirming he hadn't misspoken. It's your none. While you were asleep this morning, the 22s put it at the bottom of the lake. A memory snapped into place. Edgar's guilty, nervous face from earlier. Now he understood. They'd taken advantage of him sleeping to swipe his 19. Damn it, the house has been burgled again. Lynn inhaled to calm himself and asked the question everyone wanted to know. Why isn't it a person? Ludo shrugged. I don't know. It was Dumbledore's suggestion. Lynn mentally decided Dumbledore must be eating too many sweets and needed to cut back. A house elf led Lynn to a pier at the Black Lake. Calling it a pier was generous. It was just a narrow wooden plank jutting into the water, wide enough for only one person. No one else stood there. The cold wind brought the damp sting of the lake to his face. From the direction of the stands came the distant murmur of the crowd, students already in place, waiting for the spectacle. Lynn peered down at the Black Lake. The ice had been broken away to reveal a dark green sweep of water. A few chunks of ice drifted on the surface, rocking gently in the waves. Sunlight struck them and flashed oddly. Before he could take it all in, "Can you hear me, Lynn?" A voice came from the water. Lynn glanced down and saw a round water orb bobbing beside the pier. Its surface shimmered with a faint blue light, and inside, Ludo Bagman's overenthusiastic face swam dimly. Lynn nodded. I can hear you. Then please wait a moment. Ludo inside the orb waved. A second later, he pressed his 30 to his throat. Listen up, everyone. His voice, amplified by the 27, rang out over the Black Lake. The stands fell quiet. Every ear turned toward the water. Our champions are in position at piers around the lake. They will dive to the bottom to retrieve their treasures. An excited roar rose from the stands. They will have a full 2 hours to search, Ludo continued. If the 2 hours expire without retrieval, the task will be judged a failure. Now, on the count of 3, Lynn rolled his shoulders. The crowd's din swelled. 1, a louder cheer. 2, Lynn bent his knees. Ready. 3, a sharp whistle pierced the air. The stands exploded into thunderous applause. The huge screens above the Black Lake flickered to life. Everyone at Lynn's pier watched to see how the winner of the first task would enter the water. He bent his knees only slightly, and then he was gone. He slipped into the lake as if into air, his body breaking the surface but making no splash at all. For a second, the spectators were mute, and then gasps and shouts spilled out. Wow, no splash. How did he do that? Is that the trick? He just jumped in like that? Merlin's stockings. He didn't even prepare anything? Cheating. He must have done something before the count started. I demand he be disqualified. As Lynn dove into the water, the young wizards in the stands immediately began arguing about how he could possibly breathe down there. Ludo Bagman, commentating from the judges' table, fell silent for a moment before admitting the obvious with an embarrassed chuckle. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, I think we need our learned heads to answer that. Karkaroff was the first to speak. He's cheating. His voice was sharp and jagged with outrage. A normal wizard cannot breathe underwater without magical aid. This goes against the laws of magic. He should be. A thunderous chorus of boos drowned him out. Shut up! Karkaroff, shut up! Go back to your ship! The crowd surged as one voice. Students who had bet on Lynn were red with anger. Several Gryffindor boys stood, sleeves rolled up, as if they might charge down to tear Karkaroff's tongue out. Only Professor McGonagall's timely intervention kept anyone from rushing the podium. Ludo cleared his throat, sweating slightly. It seems Principal Karkaroff has no constructive insights. He swiftly changed tack and turned to the center of the guest dais. Let's invite Headmaster Dumbledore to weigh in. All eyes swung to Dumbledore. The big screen magnified his face, hands clasped in front of him, his smile quiet and inscrutable. If one looked closely, there was a barely perceptible twitch at one eyelid, a mind at work, puzzled. How is that boy breathing underwater? He did not know either. Could he admit it? Of course not. After a few rapid thoughts, Dumbledore's voice came slow and measured. This is talent. Silence held for a heartbeat, then erupted in disbelief. Talent! What do you mean, talent? Can talent let someone breathe underwater? Several older Ravenclaws exchanged glances. One pushed up his glasses and muttered, no matter how talented, but was cut off by another's sharp whisper. Do you dare question Headmaster Dumbledore? No one dared. Down below the surface, Lynn had no idea of the uproar. He was suspended in the dark green water, peering into the gloom. The Black Lake was far larger and more fathomless than he'd imagined. Even with decent underwater sight, he could not see the bottom. He looked up. The stands were a faint, shimmering outline, small and distant. Orienting himself by that landmark, he strode, if strode could be used for movement through water, toward the center of the lake. Swam wasn't quite right. A normal wizard might manage half a meter per stroke. With one of Lynn's strokes, he covered several times that distance. He moved as if in zero gravity, fluid and effortless, more like a fish than a struggling human. Schools of small silver fish brushed past him, sparkles in the dim water. They glanced at him with curiosity and slipped away into deeper dark. After so many failed fishing trips, Lynn's fingers ached to snatch one, but he held himself back. Later, after the competition. Deeper still, the light faded and the water grew quieter, punctuated only by the occasional current and the distant rustle of unseen creatures. Not all the lake's residents were harmless. Grindylows lurked in rock crevices and waterweeds, waiting to ambush. Lynn passed a pair hidden behind a pile of stones. Gray-green, rough-skinned, hard to spot. They lunged together, jaws full of teeth, long, skinny claws, and suddenly could not move. Somewhere along the way, Lynn had produced his wand. A freezing spell pinned the two Grindylows in place. Their eyes widened with terror. Lynn gave them a small smile. He had no mercy for dark creatures with such reputations. He tapped his wand twice, and a ribbon of light flowed into their bodies. They convulsed, fainted, then twitched and foamed at the mouth. Stupefy, laced with a curse. He sheathed his wand and continued on. Behind him, the Grindylows thrashed, still alive at least. Back at the judge's table, Dumbledore watched the screen intently. When the Grindylows leapt and Lynn dealt with them so calmly, he felt a brief, involuntary relief. The corners of his mouth twitched upward. Madame Maxime peered at him. "Headmaster Dumbledore," she asked, "is something the matter?" Dumbledore straightened, smoothing his expression. No, he said softly, merely admiring the young man's methods. He raised his teacup to his lips, and a private thought brushed his mind. No ashes. But he set it aside and sipped. Minutes slid by. Lynn's section on the big screen showed little else. He kept moving, stopping now and then to reorient himself, dealing with the occasional annoying creature. The footage was monotonous. In the stands, a first-year dozed and nodded his head until it thumped against the seat in front. He blinked awake, rubbing his forehead, only to find that everyone else was equally sleepy. "How long is he going to swim for?" someone muttered. At the judge's table, Ludo checked the timer. Time was up. He cleared his throat, pressed his speaking trumpet to his throat, and, his voice magically amplified, bellowed across the stadium. "Time's up! The Ilvermorny champions, first into the water." The broadcast cut to the Ilvermorny docks. Ryan, Thomas, and Jordan stood on their planks, each holding the same wrinkled, gray-green plant. The camera zoomed in. The plant looked like dried kelp, gillyweed. Ludo's excitement returned in full. "It's gillyweed," he cried. "It comes from the Mediterranean and was first documented by the witch Elidora Ketteridge." He launched into its origin story with relish. "Mrs. Ketteridge once tried it and nearly suffocated. She didn't know how to use it. She gasped for air until she grew dizzy and fell into a pool. But then she discovered she could breathe underwater. After eating it, gills form and you can breathe freely. On the screen, Ryan had already stuffed the gillyweed into his mouth. He chewed grimly. The taste was foul. He looked down as translucent webbing began to spread between his toes and gills formed at his neck. One by one, the three Ilvermorny students bent their knees and jumped. Splash! The stands erupted in applause. It wasn't Lynn's elegant, splashless entry, but it was decisive. Underwater, the three adjusted to their new gills and dove. They were not slow. Though they couldn't match Lynn's effortless speed, they moved far faster than an average wizard. Excellent, Ludo crowed. The Ilvermorny champions have entered the water successfully. Next, the Ouagadou champions. Please prepare. The camera switched to the Ouagadou docks. Amina, Nema, and Wanjiru stood on their planks with nothing in their hands. No props, no potions. A ripple of confusion ran through the crowd. Aren't they going in? People whispered. They didn't eat gillyweed. Do they have Lynn's talent too? On the screen, Amina's hands began to move. Complex gestures flowed, fingers interlacing, rotating, fluttering in a wordless dance. Her body twisted and contracted, her outline blurred as a faint silver light crawled beneath her skin. Then, one by one, 3 fish appeared on the wooden planks. Sleek, powerful swimmers. They thudded briefly, tails slapping the boards, and then slipped into the water with a spray. Their movement was light and swift, truly like fish in water, and their speed put them even ahead of the Ilvermorny trio. Ludo practically choked with delight. How marvelous! The Ouagadou champions have transfigured themselves into fish. They will compete in the second task in those forms. He took a breath, struggling to stay composed. Next, the Hogwarts champions, please prepare. But as the words left his mouth, the broadcast cut to the Durmstrang dock, and Victor Crumb's face darkened. They would have to wait. They still had a long wait ahead. Chapter 268, You've already chosen your own path to death. Just as everyone in the stands was watching Ouagadou's method of entering the water, Lynn ran into a small problem of his own. Deep in the black lake, the light had dwindled until you could barely make out your hand. Occasional glints from farther down drifted past, faintly illuminating the silent water. Lynn kept diving. He passed one giant boulder after another, some as large as houses, some the size of millstones, sitting mute on the lake bed, their surfaces carpeted with slimy water plants and moss. Everything was unnaturally still. He didn't stop to think about the silence. He scanned for any sign of a Merperson nest. And then, a sharp, warning bolt shot through him. The sensation was sudden and violent, like an alarm bell clanging inside his skull. Every hair on his body rose, and a chill ran down his spine. Lynn didn't have time to think. He lunged upward on instinct. Splash! 8 massive tentacles lashed out from the shadow of a boulder, driving a surge of water into the very spot he'd occupied. The force sent currents rolling viciously. Silt from the lake bed exploded into the water and immediately clouded his vision. A murky, grayish-brown haze closed around him. He hovered, heart pounding. That had been close. He'd almost been wrapped like a zongzi. He squinted into the churning gloom. What had attacked him? To be that large and hide so well his warning had barely gone off. He raised his wand. A beam of light stabbed into the silt, and an explosion charm detonated on the lake bed, sending an even bigger plume of mud upward. But the explosion hit only dirt. Whatever had struck him had already vanished into the murky current and repositioned itself. A tentacle struck from the side, moving with astonishing speed. The current it dragged was like a blade. Lynn was ready. With a flick of his wand, a massive globe of water snapped into being around him. It wasn't a trap for the enemy. It was protection. The outer layer of the sphere spun at high speed, forming a sturdy barrier. The tentacle lashed the water sphere with such force that ripples ran across its surface. The impact hurled Lynn through the water. He tumbled several times before regaining his orientation. He shook his numb arm and peered into the silt. As the cloud cleared, he finally saw what had attacked him. An octopus, but not an ordinary one. It was enormous, more than 3 times the size of a giant Pacific octopus. Its 8 tentacles could easily stretch around a small house. Each arm bristled with massive suckers, the edges of which were lined with sharp barbs. The most striking feature, though, was the series of deep blue rings across its skin. Those rings glowed faintly in the dim water, like 1,000 staring eyes. When it went into hunting mode, the rings flashed brighter, casting an eerie, beautiful light across the lake. a blue-ringed giant demon octopus. Lynn knew the description from books. The Muggle world had tiny, venomous blue-ringed octopuses. This was their Wizarding World relative, enlarged and multiplied in danger. Its size, its toxicity, its threat, everything was magnified. Texts warned that its magical resistance was absurdly high. Ordinary spells felt like tickles. It could elude detection spells. Accio and Revelio would fail to locate it. Its skin could mimic the surroundings perfectly. Lying by a rock, it could look like rock. Lost in a patch of waterweed, it could look like weed. It was intelligent, territorial, vengeful, and a determined hunter. If Lynn had hesitated an instant longer, he'd be a corpse now. The octopus hovered, its arms swaying, the blue rings pulsing as if watching him. Lynn stared back, weighing his options. This creature had a fierce sense of territory. He had already invaded it. Running would only make it chase. Better to take the initiative. But killing it would not be easy. High magical resistance, speed, perfect camouflage. He needed a plan. His gaze snagged on something tangled in the octopus's tentacles. Half buried among the massive suckers, gripped tightly by several arms, was an object with a dull color and a vaguely familiar shape. A staff. Lynn's expression went slack. That staff had been with him through countless battles. He blinked, and the caution and strategic calculation that had been in his eyes shifted. "Damn it," he said, his voice muffled but carrying through the water. "That's my staff it dragged into the lake." The octopus tilted its head. For a moment, its cold, alien eyes flashed with an odd light, not animal confusion, but understanding. It knew what it held. One of the tentacles, the one wrapped around the staff, lifted it into view. In the glow of the blue rings, the octopus held the staff up to look at it, then fixed its gaze on Lynn. That look was impossible to parse. Provocation, mockery, malice. Then the tentacle tightened. Crack! A crisp, ugly snap echoed through the water. The staff that had accompanied Lynn through so much snapped in two. Jagged wood splinters drifted in the murky water. The two halves slipped from the tentacle's grip and sank slowly. Lynn's pupils pinched to slits. He watched the two sinking halves as if frozen, deathly quiet in the water. The octopus hovered, its arms waving slowly, the blue rings flashing. It was waiting for his reaction. Lynn thrust his wand toward the surface. His eyes went incandescent with fury. "You have chosen your own path to death," he snarled. At his command, the protective water sphere exploded outward into a spray of countless streams. Lynn vanished from where he had been. The gesture wasn't only defensive, it was the start of something else. Above the black lake, the sky changed. Without warning, the clear sky buckled and filled with clouds. They rolled in unnaturally fast, as though an invisible hand had dragged them from all directions to blot out the sun. Light fled. The whole lake fell under a sudden, oppressive dusk. Thunder rumbled deep within the new cloud layer, close and loaded with menace, as if something were brewing and waiting for the right moment to break. Students and teachers in the stands looked up, confused. What's happening? The sky was clear just a moment ago. Is it going to rain? Why are the clouds so dark? Seamus Finnegan pointed up, eyes wide. This isn't right. They look like they're gathering from everywhere at once. Senior Ravenclaws exchanged worried looks. None of them could explain the phenomenon. In the Hufflepuff stands, Hannah gripped Ernie's arm, pale. "Why do I feel scared?" Edgar sat frozen, lips trembling. It couldn't be. He glanced at William, who looked equally worried. Ollie kept silent, only clenching his fists. At the judges' table, several of them stood at once. Madame Maxime's eyes widened. She stared at the roiling sky. "Is this dark magic?" she breathed. Picari shook her head, frowning. "Impossible. Dark magic doesn't work over an area this big. And the power." Karkaroff opened his mouth to say something, then shut it. Dumbledore did not rise. He sat with his head slightly tilted back, watching the darkening heavens. His silver-white beard lifted in a faint wind. Behind his half-moon spectacles, a flicker of complicated emotion passed through his eyes. He felt something contained in those cloud layers, an emotion, an intention. This was not a natural weather pattern. It was crafted, but by whom? And why? He glanced toward the large screens. They still showed Ouagadougou's perspective, giving him no clue to what was happening underwater. Before he could puzzle it out, the horizon brightened. A white shaft of light stabbed up through the gloom, illuminating the clouds so fiercely many in the stands closed their eyes. Then, Boom! A pillar of light, thick as a tower, ripped from sky to earth, tearing through the clouds and bearing down on the black lake with an earth-shaking momentum. It moved too fast to blink at. The pillar plunged into the lake. There was no thunderous explosion, no shockwave, no towering spray. The great, world-rending thunder that had seemed inevitable simply folded into the water and vanished as if into a sinkhole. The pillar dissolved into the lake so quietly it was as though nothing had happened at all. Silence fell over the stands. Everyone stared at the still raging clouds and the now empty spot where the light had hit, minds blank for a long suspended moment. Then somebody whispered, helpless and awed, "Merlin's beard." Chapter 269. Feel the pain. Deep in the Black Lake, the troll octopus hung motionless. Lynn's sudden disappearance had put it on edge. Its 8 tentacles swayed slowly as it took a defensive posture. Its instincts told it this human had been enraged, and humans could be dangerous. The eerie aura Lynn had displayed moments before had vanished, and the octopus hardened itself in response. Its head contracted, muscles tensing until it formed a round, orb-like shape. The wrinkles on its skin smoothed. The texture turned hard and slick, as if armored. The blue rings along its body flared, blinking rapidly like a cluster of eyes. Each flash sent faint ripples through the water, probing, searching for the vanished enemy. Its tentacles spread, assuming an attack stance, and the water around it churned as the rings reached a fevered frequency. Then, without warning, a bolt of lightning tore through the lake. No prelude, just a column of light that cleaved the water and struck the troll octopus. It was too fast. The octopus had no time to react. Its proud shell offered no protection. Dazzling electric light exploded along its surface, snapping the shell like glass. Cracks spidered outward from the impact point, and blinding light spilled through them, marks of the thunder ravaging its body. The octopus howled, a pained roar that shuddered through the water. Quite resilient. Lynn's voice came from behind it. The creature froze, then turned sluggishly. Every movement slowed, muscles spasming, nerves on fire. Lightning still burned through it, while a curse's aura began to suffuse its frame. Lynn's silhouette appeared before the octopus. Now, not an inch of its skin could be called intact. Its shell was webbed with fractures. Some splits went deep enough to expose charred muscle. 3 of its tentacles had been severed at the root, ends jagged and blackened, the stumps twitching. The remaining 5 were in no better shape. Some curled into electrified knots, some hung limply, all scorched. Its head, once smooth and rounded, was twisted and deformed, half charred black, the other half ghostly pale. "Quick, look what's happening in the Black Lake," Dumbledore shouted, yanking everyone's attention back. At the judge's table, Ludo Bagman scrambled, grabbed his 12, and flicked it at the giant screen. The camera that had been tracking the Wagado champion split into 7 small windows on the display. "Look, there's something going on with Lynn." All eyes turned to the window. The image magnified. Lynn hovered in the water facing the behemoth, the blue-ringed giant demon octopus. The creature roared, pain plain in the sound. It lashed out with a giant tentacle. A surge of water behind it aimed to smash Lynn like stone. Lynn didn't flinch. He raised his 12. A beam of light shot from the wand tip, not merely fiendfire, not merely lightning, but a fusion of the two. Fiendfire's heat condensed into a blade threaded with crackling lightning, a blue and white edge. It whisked through the water without a sound and sliced the attacking tentacle cleanly in 2, from tip to root. The octopus's 5 remaining tentacles had become 6 in an instant. The severed halves writhed, blue blood barely oozing, but intense heat wrapped the wounds. Before the blood could touch the lake, it was charred into blackened scabs, sealed over by blistering fire like a hot iron brand. The octopus arched, its roar turning shrill and desolate. Steam began to rise from the scorched water, white plumes boiling up into the dark depths. In the stands, silence fell. Young wizards gaped. Even the usually unflappable Weasley twins were speechless. The octopus was not ready to die. It channeled the remaining toxins in its body into its mouth, the dimmed blue rings along its skin flaring, this time concentrated into one single, blinding point as if preparing a final, desperate strike. Lynn watched, a faint smile touching his lips. Still not giving up? He flicked his 12. Instantly, the surrounding water obeyed. The currents that had been drifting leveled into purpose, rushing in from every side. A transparent sphere of water over 10 meters across coalesced at the lake bottom, faintly rimed in blue, and trapped the troll octopus at its center. The toxin burned the creature's mouth and throat, but it could neither eject it nor swallow it. It could only glare at Lynn in impotent fury. Lynn's voice slid through the water. "Don't look at me like that. I won't mourn for you. Who told you to destroy my 7? The octopus's eyelid twitched, regret, belated. If it had known the broken piece of wood meant so much, it would never have touched it. Too late now. Lynn's eyes lit. Feel the pain. The water sphere trembled. The octopus thrashed, desperate to break free, but invisible bonds held tighter than anything before. Inside the sphere, shapes began to form, at first indistinct, then clearer. 7 pairs of hands condensed from water, each pair massive enough to grip a tentacle. The first pair closed around one tentacle, then the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, until 6 tentacles were seized. The 7th pair clamped over the creature's head, palm pressed to its twisted face, and 5 fingers splayed across its skull. The octopus's eyes bulged. It tried to open its mouth to scream, but that mouth was covered. The toxin sloshed inside, unable to be expelled. Lynn's smile was cold. "Do you know what despair is? It's what you are right now." He flicked his hand. The water sphere expanded. The 7 pairs of hands pulled in every direction, left, right, forward, back, up, down, tearing the octopus apart. Under the immense force, already blighted tentacles began to shear and rip. One by one, they snapped from the body. The blue blood that might have flowed was swept away and diluted by the surrounding currents. The octopus's roars dwindled into muffled, sorrowful cries as each of its 6 tentacles were torn off. Severed limbs writhed uselessly in the water, no longer part of the creature. Only the head remained, gripped by the last hand. Shattered shell, charred skin, wrecked body. Its eyes pleaded. Lynn met that look for a heartbeat, then shook his head. Too late. He flicked his 12. The hands tightened with brutal force. With a sickening crunch, the troll octopus's head was crushed. Blue blood, shell fragments, and smashed brain tissue exploded into the water. The toxin that had lodged in its mouth at last surged free, carrying the beast's final resentment, but the water sphere still held. The poison struck the inner wall and could not pass. It rolled and boiled inside the transparent globe until it was diluted and decomposed, then dissipated. The lake stilled. Lynn walked through the water to the bottom, picked up the 2 broken pieces of the 7, shrank them carefully, and slipped them into his pocket. He looked up, checked his bearings, and resumed his original course. On the shore, Dumbledore's eyelids twitched. Good news, no ashes. Bad news, much worse, dismemberment. He tried to comfort himself. There must be a reason, he thought. Edgar's eyelids twitched too. He silently prayed the 7 he had stolen had survived. Knowing Lynn as he did, Edgar suspected it was unlikely Lynn would simply kill him. Only after Lynn had swum a fair distance away did the spectators in the stands finally recover from the thrilling slaughter that had just taken place. Then, applause erupted. Was that dark cloud in the sky caused by Lynn? A third-year Hufflepuff girl squealed, covering her mouth. It definitely was. Didn't you see that giant octopus get hit like that? The boy next to her cried. And those 7 hands at the end. My Merlin, I've never seen a spell like that before. How on earth did he do that? No idea. But it was awesome. Those who had bet on Lynn were ecstatic. Several Gryffindor gamblers were hugging each other, jumping and shouting, "We're rich! We're rich!" Over in the Ravenclaw section, a usually composed 6th-year boy was waving his fist at the sky and muttering. Whether to Merlin or to Lynn was anyone's guess. The Hufflepuff stands were positively festive. Hannah clung to Ernie's arm, bouncing up and down. Susan stood on her chair waving a Hufflepuff flag. Justin was so flushed with excitement he kept telling his classmates, "I knew it! I knew it!" As for the miserable octopus, hardly anyone cared. It was common knowledge at Hogwarts that Lynn liked fishing. That octopus had snapped his rod? Please. A bloke who could tussle with a dragon wasn't going to be missed. Besides, they were all at the judge's stand. Madame Maxime watched the giant screen, her expression complicated. She was silent for a long moment, then glanced at Dumbledore beside her. Dumbledore had a hand over his face, unsure if he was pondering life or stifling laughter. Madame Maxime realized why he had been smiling earlier, when Lynn had dealt so easily with those two Grindylows. It was admiration. "I really envy Hogwarts," she said, genuine warmth in her voice. "To have such a brilliant student." Dumbledore lifted his head at that, his eyes brightening. "If Mr. Lynn were agreeable," he said quickly and seriously, "I wouldn't mind letting him transfer." Madame Maxime stared. After a beat, she replied calmly, "I would mind." Dumbledore was left momentarily speechless. He thought silently, "Then what are you envying?" and let out a dry chuckle, turning his attention back to the giant screen as if nothing had happened. The discussion died down as Ludo Bagman stood at the commentary podium and glanced at the timer in his hand. His face froze. By Merlin, overtime. The Hogwarts champions were supposed to have entered the water 5 minutes ago. The whole octopus slaughter had thrown the schedule off, and he'd completely forgotten to announce it. Around him, the other judges whispered about the spectacle they'd just witnessed. The crowd still buzzed with excitement, and no one was watching the clock. He cleared his throat. "Ahem, Hogwarts champions, you may enter the water." The giant screen cut to the 3 Hogwarts docks. Cedric, Harry, and Roger stood on their respective planks, wands in hand. Their entries were ordinary, none of Lynn's splashless grace, none of the Uwagado students' fish-like transformations, just standard diving poses that sent up modest sprays of water. Ludo's voice chimed in at the right moment. "The Hogwarts champions have chosen the Bubblehead Charm, a very practical underwater breathing spell that creates an air bubble." He paused and let a teasing note creep in. Of course, compared to a talented competitor like Mr. Lynn, well, this method does seem a bit plain, but steady and reliable can be a strategy. A ripple of laughter ran through the stands. Underwater, Lynn hadn't gone far before he stopped. There was no danger, just a large fish swimming lazily past. Lynn's eyes lit up. He tapped his wand lightly. Before the fish could dart away, it froze, suspended. Lynn flipped over and mounted the fish. "Go," he said. His voice was soft, but the fish obeyed. A flick of its tail propelled them forward at twice the speed Lynn could have managed on his own. He patted the fish's back. "Good fish. I'll treat you to earthworms later." The fish seemed to shiver, speeding up. They dove deeper, and the scenery changed. The sandy lake bed gave way to rough stone structures, piles of stone shaped into crude houses, their surfaces mottled with algae and barnacles. Some doorways hung glowing shells that cast faint light in the depths. Lynn narrowed his eyes. He wasn't far from the merpeople gathering place. As he swam on, the stone buildings grew denser and more organized, some even 2 stories high, with strange corals growing on the roofs. Occasionally, a merperson slipped between houses, giving him a quick look before disappearing back into the maze. Lynn slid off the fish and patted its head. "All right, you can go back." The fish flicked its tail and vanished into the dark in an instant. Lynn pressed forward and soon came upon 2 figures blocking the way. They were merpeople, with iron-gray, sandpaper-like skin and dark green, seaweed-thin hair clinging in tufts. Their eyes were cloudy and set oddly wide. Their teeth were jagged and missing. Each held a crude spear pointed at Lynn. "Stop!" one barked. "Who goes there?" Lynn stopped. "I am a champion in the Triwizard Tournament," he said. "I've come to the merpeople to find something." The 2 exchanged a few words in their own language, which Lynn could make out clearly enough. Is it him? Should be. Was that huge commotion earlier caused by him? Don't know, but the chieftain said if a champion comes, we should let them pass. They lowered their spears and stepped aside. "You have less than an hour to complete your task," one of them said in English. Lynn nodded. "Thanks." He swam through the opening, and the view opened out. Before him lay a vast merfolk village, hundreds of stone houses clustered and climbing the lakebed slope. In the center of the village, on a huge square, hundreds, perhaps thousands of merpeople had gathered, and in the very center of that square stood a tall stone pillar. Chapter 271, Mermaid. "This person is playing me." Lynn was impatient to retrieve his fishing rod. He sped through the water until he reached a plaza where a large crowd of merpeople had gathered. In the center stood a tall stone pillar, and at its top more than a dozen figures were bound. Among them was, unmistakably, Lynn's fishing rod. As Lynn approached, the merpeople in the center parted to make a path. They swam to either side, clearing a wide passage, and regarding the outsider with curious eyes. No doubt the earlier commotion had reached them. A merperson, noticeably taller and uglier than the rest, swam forward along the cleared path. She wore a diadem of coral and shells and gripped a scepter inlaid with glowing pearls. She carried herself like the leader. She stopped in front of Lynn, looked him up and down, inclined her head slightly, and spoke. "Welcome, traveler from afar." Lynn inclined his head in return. "Leader," he said, "I've come to retrieve my fishing rod." The leader's mouth curved. "I know," she replied, "but you must still pass the merpeople's trial to claim your treasure." Lynn raised an eyebrow. "What trial?" Without answering directly, the leader turned, raised her scepter, and pointed at the pillar in the plaza's center. "Touch the pillar," she said. "It will tell you." The pillar was pale gray-white, covered in dense runes and patterns that emitted a faint blue glow in the murky water. Lynn swam to it, followed by a group of merpeople who either escorted him or watched closely. When he reached the pillar, one of the merpeople addressed him politely. "Shout the treasure you wish to retrieve, then touch the pillar." Lynn stared at the pillar, an expression of bemusement on his face. Who designed this trial? He imagined the scene of shouting the word for his treasure in front of all these merpeople and touching a pillar. Absurd, but he needed his rod. He grit his teeth and screamed, "Fishing rod!" The pillar reacted instantly. A hum rose through the water as light burst from its base and raced up the rune-lined shaft until the whole pillar glowed. The light gathered at its top and formed a huge rotating ring. With a soft pop, a ball of light shot from the ring toward Lynn. He reached out and caught it in his palm. The light exploded into countless streams that surged toward the wand in his other hand. The wand, swallowed by the light, was wrapped and reshaped, its outline blurring until the light faded. Where the wand had been, a broadsword now rested in Lynn's hand. The blade was broad, about 4 feet long, sharp enough to reflect his own face. Complex patterns were carved along its spine, and it gave off a cold gleam in the watery dimness. Lynn stared at the sword, then at the still glowing pillar, then back at the sword. "What is the meaning of this?" he asked. The merpeople leader swam closer, examined the sword with satisfaction, and replied, "Traveler from afar, this is the trial you have earned, a duel against a merperson warrior." A surge of water came from behind. Lynn spun. A merperson warrior was charging at him, broadsword raised, the same model as the one in Lynn's hand. The warrior was larger than a typical merperson, iron-gray skin, scarred by battles, muscles taut. He glared at Lynn and without hesitation slashed down. On the shore, the scene was clearly visible and drew a chorus of gasps from the stands. Ludo Bagman's voice rose above them, breathless with excitement. "Oh, Mr. Lynn is facing a one-on-one duel with a merperson warrior to retrieve his treasure. And look, his wand has been turned into a broadsword by the pillar. He can't use magic. He must face the merperson with pure physical force." Underwater, the broadsword's arc cut the water with a sharp hiss. Merpeople excelled at explosive movements in water. If that strike connected, it could cleave a man in two. Lynn reacted fast, dropping his shoulders and twisting aside so the blade only grazed his shoulder, tearing a small scrap from his robe. He seized the opening to pivot and face his attacker, sword up. The merperson warrior missed his first blow but flowed straight into another, spinning his wrist so the broadsword swept up toward Lynn's lower abdomen. Lynn had no time to plan and instinctively raised his blade to block. The swords collided with a thunderous clang that sent a shockwave through the water. Lynn felt the impact in his arm and was knocked back, tumbling before he could steady himself. In a matter of moments, he had already been sent flying twice. The warrior's power was staggering. The leader's voice carried from the side. "Traveler from afar, the rules are simple. You may fight however you wish, but you may not use magic. The pillar has temporarily sealed your wand. Only by defeating your opponent will you reclaim your treasure." Lynn looked at the sword in his hands and confirmed he could sense no magic from his wand at all. Fine. If he couldn't use magic, he would rely on pure physical force. He gripped the hilt and adopted a stance. He knew little of formal swordplay, but perfect bodily control let him mimic movements he had observed with precise physical coordination. The merperson warrior charged like an arrow released from a bow. In an instant, he was upon Lynn, sweeping his broadsword toward Lynn's neck. Lynn ducked and thrust his own blade toward the opponent's lower belly. The warrior twisted, avoiding the thrust, and countered with a backhanded slash aimed at Lynn's head. Clang after clang, each clash sent water and sediment churning. Bubbles speckled the plaza as shockwaves rippled outward. The warrior's swordplay was brutal and efficient, fast, heavy, and aimed at vital points with no wasted motion. Lynn's perfect bodily control let him dodge and parry with precision that ordinary humans could not achieve. But the problem remained. The strength gap was huge. Another collision sent Lynn sliding several meters as his arm went numb and his sword almost flew free. The attacker closed in with relentless strikes. Lynn blocked again and again until his handweb split, blood clouding the water. His arm numbed and nearly failed to hold the sword. His breath quickened, not from exhaustion, but from frustration. He was a dignified wizard, someone who could stand up to dragons, yet here he was being overwhelmed by a merperson on raw physicality alone. How could he ever face his peers at Hogwarts if this became known? A look of disdain flashed in the merperson warrior's eyes. "All right," Lynn thought, "you look down on me?" He shut his eyes and triggered a long-neglected ability. 1,000 refinements. Bones strengthened, muscles resculpted, and blood fire coursed through him. The warrior blinked, wondering if his opponent had simply stopped to rest. Lynn opened his eyes. A small, confident curve touched his lips. "Come," he said. Then Lynn vanished from where he stood, moving faster than the warrior's last charge. The merperson's pupils contracted as he lifted his blade to block. Clang! The impact was louder than any before. The warrior was slammed backward, disbelief in his eyes. The same weak human who had been knocked away moments ago was now knocking him back with each blow. Lynn pursued like a cannonball, iron in his blows. Strike after strike hammered the warrior's defenses. His arm numbed, the webbing of his hand began to split, his sword wrenched loose from his grip. Lynn's strikes came faster and harder each time, a violent storm of blows. Finally, the last blow sent the warrior's sword flying in an arc. It plunged into the distant mud with a soft splash. The warrior stared at his empty hands, then at Lynn, who held the blade pointed less than a centimeter from his throat. The plaza fell into a stunned silence. All the merpeople watched, dumbfounded that their champion had been bested by an outsider using sheer physical force. After several seconds, Lynn lowered his sword, shook his wrist, slung the blade over his shoulder, and looked down at the warrior. "Convinced yet?" he asked. The merperson warrior opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. He only stared at Lynn, eyes reflecting a mix of shock, resentment, and grudging respect. "This guy is playing me." Before the moment could become awkward, the merpeople leader's voice broke the silence. "Traveler from afar, congratulations on passing the trial." Lynn nodded and tossed the broadsword aside. It fell into the mud, turned into a ray of light, and flew back to the pillar. The light faded, and his wand returned from the direction of the pillar, landing squarely in his hand. He gripped his wand and quickly cast Dittany Protection to seal and heal the wounds. He couldn't risk infection. Incredible. Simply incredible. Mr. Lynn has defeated a merperson warrior using only physical force, without using any magic. On the shore, Ludo Bagman's voice boomed out over the stands. Especially that final flurry, blow after blow, each one like a mountain. That battle-hardened merperson was forced to retreat by his strikes, even had its weapon knocked away. On the big screen, at the edge of the Black Lake, the stone pillar where the prize had been tied glowed. Lynn's token was untied. A merperson warrior swam up to the top of the pillar, removed the rope from the broken relic, and respectfully carried it toward Lynn. Lynn waved his wand impatiently. The token whooshed out of the merperson's hand and landed neatly in his palm. He looked down at it, his expression unreadable. 40 minutes and 7 seconds, Ludo announced, checking the timer. Mr. Lynn is the first champion to find his treasure. Now he only needs to bring the token safely back to shore to complete the task. The stands erupted into applause. Those who had backed Lynn began to celebrate in earnest. But on the screen, after taking the token, Lynn didn't seem intent on leaving. He stood there, studying the pillar and the figures tied to it again and again. On the judge's dais, Karkaroff's heart skipped. A cold dread ran from his tailbone to his head. He stared at Lynn's face on the screen, at the way his eyes moved. What is this boy? Trying to do what? He couldn't let himself think it, but the feeling grew. No, he couldn't be considering it. Unless Karkaroff's stomach tightened. Sure enough, underwater, Lynn turned and spoke to the merpeople leader. "Respected merperson leader," he said, polite as could be, "may I touch that stone pillar again?" The merperson leader scratched its head, its ugly face scrunching as it tried to recall the instructions Dumbledore had given that morning when he brought the champions to the lake. "There will be several champions coming to your village. Each champion will come to find their own treasure. You just need to let them undergo the test." It had been told, each champion will come to find their own treasure. It had not been told, each champion may only take one treasure. If it wasn't forbidden, perhaps it was allowed. The merperson leader nodded. "You may." A faint smile tugged at the corner of Lynn's mouth. He turned and swam back toward the stone pillar. On shore, Karkaroff's eyes went wide. He watched Lynn's back on the big screen, his lips beginning to tremble. "No, no," he prayed inwardly. "Take the Beauxbatons Champion's prize. Take Ilvermorny's. Take Wagadoo's. Anyone but Hermione, Rose, Lisa," Lynn called out, his voice carrying clearly through the magic. Karkaroff's world collapsed. The names Lynn had spoken were all Durmstrang students' names, none from any other school. Ludo Bagman's commentary crackled with barely suppressed excitement. "Oh, Mr. Lynn has not chosen to leave. He has touched the pillar again. He has called the names of the other 3 prizes." The pillar paused, hummed, and then burst into color. A huge ball of light fell into Lynn's hands. His wand disappeared again as the token transformed into 3 large blades. Does this pillar only know how to turn into blades? 5 minutes later, 3 merperson warriors lay sprawled beside the pillar. The first who charged was knocked aside by one of Lynn's blades, the weapon embedding in a distant coral reef where it could not be pried out. The second tried to sneak in from the flank, but Lynn didn't bother to turn. He just swatted backward with the flat of his blade. The merperson spun through the water and thudded into the mud, unable to rise. The third tried to circle and skirmish, but Lynn stood there with a blade over his shoulder and watched. It circled 3 times. Then Lynn moved, a horizontal sweep whose blunt edge caught the merperson squarely on the rear. It screamed and flew into the first warrior, who had finally wedged itself out of the coral. They crashed together, rolled across the lake bed, and came to rest in a heap. The 3 lay motionless, groaning and unable to get up. The square fell silent. All the merpeople stared, blank-faced, at the scene, their warriors subdued one after another by the same person, and all with the very same motion, the back of a blade. The merperson who had dueled Lynn from the beginning stood at the edge of the crowd, watching. Its expression moved from shock to confusion, from confusion to dawning realization, and then to certainty. The human had been acting from the start. The stumbles, the cut hands, the seeming disadvantage. It had been a performance. Now it understood. He wasn't truly fighting them. He was toying with them. Its face flushed, if an iron-gray face could flush. It clenched its fists and began to surge forward to confront him, but seeing the 3 kin on the ground, it loosened its grip. No, better not to provoke him. Lynn shrugged the blade onto his shoulder and looked at the merperson leader. The leader took a deep breath, then asked, "Guest, do you still wish to obtain the prizes?" Lynn thought for a moment and shook his head. No need. He could be a jerk sometimes, but not so far gone that he'd offend everyone for no reason. None of the other schools had provoked him. He still wanted to act decently. The merperson leader visibly relaxed and waved its scepter. The ropes binding the 3 figures at the top of the pillar snapped, and the 3 suspended girls began to drift down. Lynn swam over and looked at them. The girls stared back, wide-eyed and bewildered. Lynn gave them a casual wave. "Yo." Hermione, floating there, said nothing. The brown-haired girl, Rose, was the first to react. She recoiled, eyes flashing with hostility through the bubblehead charm. "You are Lynn from Hogwarts." Lynn raised an eyebrow. "What about me?" Rose didn't answer. She stared at him, then began to struggle. "Let me go. I don't need you to save me. Our Durmstrang champion will come for me. Let me go." Her words cut off as Lynn lifted his wand. Whoosh! A stoopfi caught her cleanly. Rose's voice stopped. Her eyes rolled back, and she floated, limp, in the water. Lynn lowered his wand and looked at the short-haired girl beside her, Lisa, whose mouth trembled and whose gaze darted between Lynn and the unconscious Rose. You? How could you? Whoosh, another stupefy. Lisa went slack and floated beside Rose. Two motionless bodies drifted in the water. Lynn nodded slightly in satisfaction, then turned to the last girl, Hermione. She was looking at the two unconscious Durmstrang girls, then at Lynn, her expression tangled. She lifted her hands and waved them, slow, careful motions that clearly meant, I'm fine, I'm all right, don't do anything. Lynn studied Hermione's nervous face and the gestures with mild amusement. Why are you waving your hands? Do you think I'd do anything to my own friend? That's not necessarily true. Chapter 273, Horse-Shaped Water Monster Night. Passing through the Merpeople village, Lynn returned once more to the dangerous waters of the Black Lake. The surrounding light suddenly dimmed. The crude stone buildings, glowing shells, and dense coral reefs lay far behind. In their place stretched an endless gloom, with occasional glimmers from the deeper lake bed that appeared and disappeared in the dark green water. Lynn felt he had loitered long enough by that stone pillar. He'd fought 4 battles and even fished out the treasures for those 3 Durmstrang lads while he was at it. But on his way back, there was still no sign of the other champions. In the empty water, only he and the string of treasures behind him swam slowly. Lynn frowned. Were they lost? Had they already withdrawn? That couldn't be right. Bagman had said there was a 2-hour time limit for the task. It had only been a bit over half that time. Even if the other champions were slow, they should have reached the Merpeople village by now. As Lynn pondered this, a dissatisfied shout came from behind him. Lynn, let me go. I can swim on my own. He turned. A rope, condensed by transfiguration, had skewered the 3 of them together like a candied hawthorn stick. At the front was Hermione, glaring at him with wide eyes. In the middle was the brown-haired girl, Ruth, still unconscious, floating limply and occasionally swaying with the current. At the end was the short, black-haired Lisa, also unconscious and hanging like a stranded fish. Lynn glanced at Hermione and shook his head. You're spoils of war, he said flatly. If you run off, won't my rescue have been for nothing? Spoils of war? Exactly. I rescued you from the stone pillar. Theoretically, you're my trophy now. You'll only be free when I bring you back to shore. What kind of twisted logic is that? It's not twisted, it's the rules. The rules never said anything like that. They also didn't say it couldn't be interpreted this way. Hermione was left speechless. She took a deep breath and tried to calm herself. You're just retaliating, because I contradicted you at the stone pillar. Lynn tilted his head, pretending to try to remember. Did that happen? Yes. How come I don't remember? You. Hermione's face flushed with anger. Seeing her like that made the corner of Lynn's mouth twitch. I have no idea what you're talking about. He turned and resumed swimming. From behind came Hermione's voice through gritted teeth. Lynn, just you wait. Lynn waved a hand without looking back. Wait then. We'll talk on the surface. They bickered like that through the dark water. Lynn was in a good mood. Although part of his equipment had been broken, he had recovered a piece of it. He could repair it once he got back. Hermione kept muttering threats. You're abusing your authority. I'll tell Professor McGonagall. You'll get points deducted. But Lynn acted as if he hadn't heard. Then, from the distance, a dull booming sound rolled toward them. It was low and heavy, like some massive object moving rapidly or thunder echoing across the lake bed. Hermione's voice died away. She jerked her head toward the sound. The lake bed was a black void. Nothing could be seen. Only the booming grew closer and louder, vibrating the currents until they trembled. Hermione's expression changed. Lynn. Before she could finish, a sudden, powerful force struck. Hermione felt her bonds tighten. She and the others were jerked violently toward Lynn. The force hit so fast and hard that Hermione had no time to cry out before she was pulled several meters. When she came to, she found she was behind Lynn. He held the other end of the rope, eyes fixed ahead. Following his gaze revealed why. A massive beast was galloping out of the darkness. It was a horse, but more than 3 times the size of an ordinary one, gleaming coldly in the dark water. Its mane was not hair, but clusters of slender waterweed that drifted as it ran. its hooves kicking as it slammed into the oncoming Kelpie. The two titans collided with a thunderous boom. A shockwave rippled outward, kicking up silt and churning the surrounding water. Debris scattered everywhere. The collision resulted in a stalemate, the Erumpent's hooves planted deep in the lake bed as it pushed forward, while the Kelpie lowered its massive head and braced its sharp teeth against the Erumpent's horns. The two beasts wrestled like that. Uh, Ladies and gentlemen, it seems our broadcasting equipment has lost track of Mr. Lynn. The Kelpie he's riding is moving too fast for the image to keep up. A chorus of disappointed sighs rose from the stands, but Bagmen rallied quickly. It doesn't matter. The footage of the other champions is still coming. Let's continue to follow their performances. The screen switched to other champions, but most people's attention had already shifted. They were all waiting for Lynn. A few minutes later, the lake's surface exploded as a giant Kelpie burst out of the water. It leaped in a graceful arc and landed with a solid thud on the grassy shore. On its back, Lynn sat in front, one hand on the mane and the other waving to the stands. Hermione clung to his robes, still shaken. Further back, Ruth and Lisa lay draped like rag dolls, unconscious. For a heartbeat, the stands were silent. Then they erupted. Lynn! 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 Young spectators leapt from their seats, waving flags and scarves, cheers and whistles blending until the whole stand shook. From the judge's table, Bagman's voice called out, "Mr. Lynn is the first champion to arrive. Total time, 59 minutes. He paused, then added with a grin, and not only did he return himself, but he also brought back his spoils, the 3 treasures of Durmstrang. Laughter and applause followed. Lynn climbed down from the Kelpie and patted its head. All right, you can go back now. The Kelpie seemed relieved, flicked its tail, and turned back toward the lake. With a powerful bound, it plunged into the water and was gone. Chapter 254. Harry, why? Lynn turned and faced the stands. He straightened his water-soaked robes, put on his practiced smile, and bowed elegantly to the crowd. Then, ah! Screams rippled through the stands like a tidal wave. Lynn! 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 So handsome! He's mine! A group of girls in the front rows hugged each other, jumping and crying with joy. Confetti popped into the air. Cheers for our hero, Fred shouted. Even if he stole the spotlight that should have gone to Gryffindor, George added. But we don't mind. Because he's just too handsome. Get an autograph. Sign it on my collarbone. With the twins egging them on, things quickly threatened to get out of hand. At the edge of the stands, a commotion broke out. Don't stop me! A sharp female voice cut through the chaos. Lynn looked up to see several witches in the front row pressing forward, frantic. Security spread their arms to hold them back. Calm down. Please calm down. A young wizard's face had gone red from being shoved back by two determined witches. Get out of the way. I want to go down. I want an autograph. I want a photo. The staff were flustered. And then a small, lithe figure slipped past from the side. As agile as a monkey, she used the distraction to leap off the edge of the stands. Stop right there, a professor shouted, but the girl had already landed. Her feet hit the grass and she sprinted toward Lynn with astonishing speed. Lynn blinked. He was about to wave his wand and get away when the girl was suddenly in front of him. He took half a step back. You. Before he could finish, she produced a tube of lipstick from her pocket. She twisted off the cap, yanked down the collar of her dress to expose half a shoulder, and thrust the lipstick into his hand. Sign here. Her eyes shone with expectation. Lynn stared at the lipstick, then at the bare shoulder, then back at the lipstick. His brain stalled. What was this move? He sighed inwardly and waved his wand. Instantly, her clothes snapped back into place, covering the shoulder. The girl froze. She looked down at her dress, then back at Lynn, her expression collapsing from hope to hurt. What are you doing? Before she could finish, the staff closed in. Miss, let go at once. Return to the stands. This is against the rules. The girl ignored them and grabbed Lynn's arm, refusing to let go. I'm not leaving, she shouted. I want a photo with Lynn. I want an autograph. I want. There was a sharp rip. Lynn looked down. A tear had been torn into the sleeve of his robe. He said nothing. Ludo Bagman, watching from the stands, sighed with a faraway look. Truly mad, he murmured. I remember when I was young, my performance at the Quidditch World Cup felt almost like this. I scored 150 points that match. The whole stadium roared. Witches screamed for me. He paused, lost in the memory. It was glorious. Madame Pomfrey finally arrived at the field, face set in grim lines. She seized Lynn's wrist and hauled him aside. He nearly stumbled. Madame Pomfrey, I'm fine. Whether you're fine or not isn't for you to say, she snapped, pulling him toward the medical tent. Come with me. Full checkup. Not a single test skipped. Lynn tried to look back over his shoulder. But the tournament is over, she cut him off. You are my patient now. She didn't give him a chance to argue and launched into a tirade as she shepherded him across the grass. 7 girls fainted from excitement already. 7. Her voice echoed, full of exasperation. And this is only the second task. By the end of it, will it be 70? 700? Lynn stumbled along, keeping up as best he could. And this Tri-Wizard tournament, Madame Pomfrey went on, is far too dangerous, outrageous, letting students fight dragons, duel merpeople, get dragged around by kelpies. Are we training wizards or soldiers? Lynn started to protest, but she cut him off. You be quiet. You single-handedly dealt with a troll octopus, fought 4 merpeople, and rode a kelpie, and you say it wasn't dangerous? He fell silent. And Dumbledore. Madame Pomfrey's ire shifted. He sits there drinking tea and eating sweets, not caring about students' safety at all. He actually agreed to hold this competition. He must have eaten so much sugar his brain's gone soft. Lynn inwardly lit a candle for Dumbledore. If you ask me, she pressed on, spittle flecking his face with her excitement, Hogwarts should cancel all these messy classes, divination, muggle studies. What use are they? There should be a practical magical medicine course. Teach students how to stitch, how to stop bleeding, how to handle emergencies, how to survive out in the wild. If every student knew basic medical care, well, not everyone like you, you're ridiculous. But if everyone had basic knowledge, they could at least save themselves after being hurt. Isn't that more important than fancy spells? Lynn nodded repeatedly, even though he hadn't really processed a single word. It seemed the right thing to do. Seeing his attitude, Madame Pomfrey calmed a little and pushed the tent curtain aside. "Sit," he obeyed. She pulled out jars and bottles and began her examination. "Take off your clothes." "Huh?" "Take them off," she said sharply. "I need to check for injuries, broken ribs, internal damage." Lynn opened his mouth to protest, but one look at Madame Pomfrey made him silent. He submitted to a thorough check: heart rate, blood pressure, magical fluctuations, mental state, everything. She even held his eyelids open and shone her wand light into his pupils for a long moment. Only after she found nothing wrong did she relent. "All right," she said, putting the wand away, though the tone of her voice was still chiding. "No problems for now, but if you feel anything, pain, dizziness, come to me immediately. No toughing it out on your own." Lynn thanked her and climbed down from the examination bed. "I'll be going then." "Off with you," she waved, already packing bottles. He dashed back to the stands. The competition was nearing its end, and tension had replaced the earlier giddiness. All eyes were fixed on the large screen, showing the champions still battling in the water. Ludo Bagman's voice boomed across the stadium. "The champions from Castellabruxo and Ilvermorny have reached the shore." On the screen, Daniel, Louis, and Nicholas hauled themselves out of the water, soaked and gasping. Not far off, Ryan, Thomas, and Jordan also crawled ashore, collapsed on the grass, utterly spent. A round of applause broke out. "The Ilvermorny champions performed excellently. Castellabruxo weren't far behind," Ludo declared. "Now let's see what's happening still in the water." The view switched. In the dark lake, several figures were still swimming hard. The champions from Ilvermorny, Ouagadougou, and 2 from Hogwarts are making for the shore with their treasures. Ludo's voice climbed. "Their positions are very close. No one can pull away yet. This will be an intense sprint. The Durmstrang champions are in pursuit." The screen changed again. Crumb, Louis, and Katya were chasing from behind, closing fast but still trailing the leaders. "It seems that, since they can't complete the task," Ludo said, the inflection sharp, "they may be trying to stop the others from finishing as well." A chorus of boos rose from the stands. Lynn raised a brow. Were they conceding and lashing out? But Ludo's next line seized everyone's attention. "And the Hogwarts champion, Harry Potter, has not yet secured his treasure." The screen cut to Harry. He was suspended in a darker pocket of the lake, his wand gripped in one hand, while the weak light of his bubblehead charm flickered. He looked miserable, truly miserable. He felt certain he was about to die. He waved his wand desperately. A stupefy flashed from the tip. The merperson warrior dodged easily and slammed the flat of its blade against Harry's shoulder. He was knocked under, surfacing with a gasp as the bubble clung to him. The warrior hovered, blade in hand, its expression murderous. Harry couldn't understand it. The merpeople who had opposed the Beauxbatons champions earlier hadn't fought like this. Cedric had told him that, though the merperson test was dangerous, if you showed enough strength and will, they would let you pass. So why was it so vicious with him? The merperson struck again. Harry dodged instinctively, the rush of water from the swing throwing him off balance, so he rolled over twice. He steadied himself and stared at the warrior, confusion and despair filling him. Why? Why was it being so ruthless to him? What he didn't know was that this merperson was the very first one who'd faced Lynn at the beginning. It had been blown away by Lynn's single strike, watched him cut through 3 matches one after another, and realized it had been outplayed from the start. It was in a foul mood, very, very foul. Suspended in the water, it gripped its sword hilt and stared at the 4-eyed boy in front of it. Human champion. Another Hogwarts challenger. Another who looked weak. Was this another pretender? A weakling playing at bravery? Was he acting again? It didn't know for sure, but it had decided. Whether he was faking it or not, it would beat the truth out of him. Even if it could not win, it would not allow itself to be made a fool of again. If this boy truly was weak, the beating would teach him. If he was hiding strength, the brutality would force it out. Either way, the merperson's anger found its focus. It kicked its tail and charged at Harry once more. Harry stared, helpless. Chapter 275, Lessons Learned. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ludo Bagman's voice echoed over the stands through a magical loudspeaker. He stood before the judge's table, holding a long roll of parchment, a grin on his face as if he'd just hit the jackpot. After intense deliberation by the panel of judges, we have determined the scores for our champions. The stands fell silent. Everyone strained to listen to the portly wizard in the center. At the judges' table, the various headmasters' expressions ranged from pleased to neutral. Only Karkaroff looked sour. The second task is scored on a 100-point scale, Ludo continued. Schools that rescue their treasures within the time limit and return to shore will receive a base score of 30 points. A low buzz ran through the stands. If a treasure is rescued, but a rival is past the 2-hour mark, only 15 points will be awarded. Harry's face fell. He had finished the task, but he'd gone over the time limit. He'd been chased and slashed at by that Merperson warrior for what felt like an age before breaking free, but he'd still been late. 15 instead of 30, half the base points. He sighed, trying to comfort himself. Better than 0. If not a single treasure is rescued. Ludo paused, casting a subtle glance toward the Durmstrang camp. Unfortunately, 0 points will be given. There was dead silence in the Durmstrang stands. In addition, Ludo went on, excluding Principal Karkaroff's score. Each judge has 10 points, 70 points in total. These 70 points will be awarded based on the champions' performances during the task. Most of the champions visibly relaxed. They'd all finished within the time limit and secured the base points. The judges' scores might not create an insurmountable gap. Only Harry stayed glum. Now, let us announce the scores for the second task. Ludo cleared his throat and unrolled the parchment. Mr. Lynn, the first champion to complete the task. The venue hushed instantaneously. Lynn's face filled the large screen. He stood calm and unreadable. He demonstrated astonishing combat skill when dealing with those creatures. Ludo's voice rose. From the blue-ringed giant demon octopus to the 4 Merperson warriors and then the Grindylow, his performance was nothing short of perfect. Warm applause broke out. Therefore, Ludo paused, drawing out the suspense. We award him a score of 99 points. The applause stopped as if hit. Lynn's composed mask cracked. 99. Where did that missing point go? Whispers rippled through the crowd. 99 points? Not a full score? Why deduct a point? Was his performance not perfect? Seeing the murmur grow, Ludo hurried on. Headmaster Dumbledore's reason for the 1-point deduction is he could afford to be a little less brutal. The place fell momentarily silent. Then laughter bubbled up. Ha ha! Dumbledore said brutal. It was brutal. Look what happened to that octopus. Lynn glanced toward Dumbledore at the judge's table. The headmaster held a teacup and gave him a small, kindly nod. The smile clearly said, Child, I did it for your own good. Lynn looked away, silently adding another mental note against Dumbledore. The champions of Castello Bruxo, the second to complete the task, Ludo announced. Although they entered the water later, their performance was commendable, especially Mr. Daniel, who once again used a bottle of wine to obtain clues about the merpeople's village from the lake dwellers, saving them time and leaving a deep impression on the judges. It was as if Dionysus himself had descended. Friendly laughter rolled through the stands. After deliberation, their score is 93 points. The Castello Bruxo camp erupted. Daniel pumped his fist. Louis and Nicholas hugged and jumped. Principal Lemma sat straighter, pride on his face. Ilvermorny is next, Ludo read on. The 3 champions, Ryan, Thomas, and Jordan, were outstanding. They demonstrated excellent teamwork and tactical prowess. Their score is 90 points. The champions of Beauxbatons, the third to come ashore, Ludo called. Their perseverance moved the judges, especially Miss Chloe, who completed the task despite being injured by a Grindylow. Lynn glanced at Chloe. She'd had a rough run, bitten by red venomous ants in the first task, and then injured here. Another round of warm applause followed. 87 points. Madame Maxime smiled in satisfaction. The champions of Ouagadou, 4th place, Ludo continued. They showed exceptional transfiguration during the competition. Their technique of turning themselves into fish was breathtaking. A wave of admiration swept the stands. Their score is 83 points. Principal Okoye stroked his beard, pleased. Next was Hogwarts. Because of Harry's overtime, their score was only 57 points, but compared to Durmstrang's fat 0, it still looked respectable. When the judges finished, the second task drew to a close. Sunlight spilled over the surface of the black lake, sparkling. For the champions, it had been a jumble of triumphs and disappointments. Their moods roughly tracked their scores. As for Durmstrang's champions, they had vanished somewhere. For the students, the actual match had been a bit short, but the post-competition money distribution was far more entertaining. The Weasley twins were at the center of a compact throng, surrounded 3 layers deep and completely impassable. "Fred, my galleons." "George, I bet on Lynn to win, 5 galleons." "Mine too, 10 galleons." Fred and George stood amid the crowd with several bulging cloth bags at their feet, frantically counting and handing out coins with smiles wide as the lake. Don't worry," Fred yelled, passing a sack to a Gryffindor lad. "Here, 7 galleons, count them carefully." "George, over here." Another student squeezed through. George mopped his brow and pulled out 8 galleons. "Yours." The scene was chaotic for a while. On the edge of the crowd, Ron watched, green with envy. His eyes were fixed on the cloth bags as coins clattered out. He swallowed and muttered, "So many galleons, if only they were mine." A few Gryffindors trotted past, clutching their winnings, grinning. "Ron, did you bet?" one called. Ron's face froze. Of course I did," he lied, forcing bravado. "Where's my money?" The student waved a fat handful of galleons. "Go get it," he said. Ron laughed awkwardly and watched people celebrating. His stomach tightened. Where was Ginny? Had she lost his money? Just then, she emerged from the crowd, clutching a small cloth bag. Ron's eyes lit up. He lunged toward her. "I knew it," he cried, breathless. "I knew Fred and George wouldn't keep your pocket money. Give it to me. Give it to me." Ginny snatched the bag to her chest with such speed and alertness that even Harry nearby was impressed. "This isn't yours," she said casually. Ron's hand froze mid-reach. His smile stuck. "What?" Ginny's mouth tilted just so. "I have good news and bad news," she said. "Which do you want first?" Ron could barely breathe. "Good news," she nodded. "The good news is," she jingled the bag in front of him, "I won this bag of money, betting with my own pocket money." Ron brightened. "Who did you bet on?" "Lynn." "How much did you win?" 5 sickles turned into 5 galleons. Ron gaped. 5 galleons. With his own pocket money, he couldn't save that much in a year. Ginny tucked the bag away, smiling. "And the bad news?" The smile faded a little. "When I placed the bet, Fred and George realized that I was betting for you." Ron's smile died. "And then?" "They confiscated your money," Ginny said. "They called it an IQ tax to help you remember the lesson." "They did what?" Ron's eyes went wide. "They said next time you want to bet, go place it yourself. Don't have your sister hide in the back. It's too embarrassing for the Weasley name." Ginny paused, remembering the exchange, and couldn't help a small laugh. Ron stood taking it in, slack-jawed. Ginny patted his shoulder. "Don't be sad. At least you learned a lesson." Ron looked at her. Was she comforting him or rubbing it in? Ginny shrugged and walked off. "I'm going to count my money," she called without turning back. Ron watched her go, wanting to cry but with no tears left. After March arrived, the weather eased. Sunlight broke through the clouds now and then, throwing a faint golden sheen across the icy surface of the Black Lake. The drafts in the castle corridors had lost a little of their winter bite. Walking outside no longer felt like your face would freeze off. That evening, Lynn had finished dinner in the Great Hall, but didn't head straight back to the common room. He had something important on his mind, something he'd been planning for a week, making Dumbledore feel a little pain. He stood alone in a secluded corridor on the 19th floor, the Marauder's map borrowed from Fred and George, folded in his left hand, a crystal vial of a nasty liquid clutched in his right. He stared at Dumbledore's office marked on the map, thinking it over. Edgar had told him the Ministry of Magic was holding a meeting that night, and Dumbledore had been invited. It had been mentioned casually by his parents too, so the information seemed reliable. Lynn checked his watch, 7:53. The meeting began at 8. Dumbledore should be leaving soon. Sure enough, the Albus Dumbledore dot pacing inside the office on the map vanished a second later. Fawkes disappeared with him. Lynn's mouth twitched into a small smile. He folded the map, tucked the crystal vial into his pocket, and with a flick of his wand cast a disillusionment charm over himself. Then he pulled his homemade cloak over his shoulders, 2 layers of camouflage for double safety. He pushed open a corridor window and launched himself into the night. The cold wind slammed his robes around him, but he stayed close to the castle's outer wall and rose silently toward the tower. The window outside the headmaster's office came into view. He pressed himself flat against the stone and peered through the narrow gap in the curtains. Only a faint light burned, either embers in the fireplace or a small enchanted lamp left alight. The portraits were curtain-covered, their frames only faintly visible, restless no longer. It looked like the past heads had turned in for the night. Lynn nodded. Everything was going according to plan. He pushed at the window. Click, click. It didn't budge. He tried again. Click, click. Still locked. He leaned closer and could see a thin shadow where the sash met the frame. Dumbledore had thought to lock up. Lynn didn't try to force it. He didn't want to trigger any alarms. He lifted his wand and gently levitated a small silver object from Dumbledore's desk. Through the gap in the curtains, he guided it, and it floated over to where the latch sat. A tiny metallic click, and the window slipped open from the inside. Lynn slid through the gap and landed softly on the office carpet. The relief that flooded him was almost comic. Standing in the headmaster's office for the first time, he felt a twinge of guilt at being a thief. The fireplace embers glowed a dull red, bathing the room in dim light. Shelves towered with books and curios. An armchair hunched in the corner, and Fawkes's perch was empty except for a scattering of gold feathers on the floor. Lynn forced his hands to stay out of temptation and navigated around the silver instruments and the armchair, edging toward the large desk. He crouched on the inner side and began to search. Dumbledore had to have sweets somewhere close by. He couldn't stand a day without his sugar. Lynn eased open the first drawer and found a transparent box filled with black, cockroach-shaped candies. They looked grotesquely lifelike, but he knew these were one of Dumbledore's favorites. He drew the crystal bottle, selected the plumpest pieces, used his wand to pry the box open, and carefully applied drops of the potion. Drip, 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 drip. 5 drops, spread among different positions in the box, so any candy Dumbledore took would have a chance of being laced. He slipped the vial back into his pocket, returned the box to the drawer, and closed it gently. He crouched a moment, grinning to himself. The potion had been a week's work, days of trial and error. It was colorless, odorless, and non-toxic. Standard tests would never detect it. Its only effect was agonizing bitterness, an utterly overwhelming, explosive bitterness that attacked both the taste buds and the nerves. Lynn remembered tasting a stirring rod once during experiments and recoiling so violently he lay on the floor for 10 minutes. 5 of those cockroach sweets were now baited. No matter which one Dumbledore ate, he imagined it so clearly he almost laughed out loud. That'll teach him for calling my wand a scrap of metal. Lynn crawled back out the window and hovered on the wall outside, wrapped tighter in his cloak. He watched the office through the curtains as the night dragged on. 8:30. 9. 9:45. No one. He cast a small warming charm as the wind sharpened against his face and began to doubt Edgar's information. What ministry meeting? Dumbledore had been gone more than an hour. 10. 11. 12. Lights dwindled in the castle, and Hogwarts fell into a near silence, broken only by distant night birds from the Forbidden Forest. Lynn waited from 8 until 1 in the morning and was ready to give up. Just as he was about to leave, a flare of firelight burst inside the office. Fawkes materialized from the flames and settled on his perch, shaking loose sparks of warmth. Dumbledore stepped out after him. Lynn froze, heart pounding. He pressed himself against the stone and watched every movement. Dumbledore set down a heavy stack of papers, breathed out, and rubbed his brow. His hand reached, almost without thinking, for the drawer. He opened it, took out the box of cockroach sweets, and smiled a little to himself. He fingered around inside, then pinched one from the middle, one of the 5 Lynn had treated. He held it to his eyes for a moment as if inspecting it, and then put it into his mouth and began to chew as calmly as if tasting candy. At once, his face changed. The chewing froze. His Adam's apple bobbed as he forced it down. He sat still, hands suspended over the box. After several seconds, he reached for a glass of water and drank it down in a hurry. Gulp, 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 emptying the cup. He set it down and stared into the open box with an expression that mixed surprise and a kind of wounded betrayal, as if an old friend had deceived him. He reached for another, His fingers brushed the edge of the box, but then he withdrew them. Outside, Lynn pressed his hand to his mouth not to laugh and felt a delicious, triumphant warmth. Satisfied, he slipped away into the night. Inside the office, Dumbledore sighed, closed the box, and put it back into the drawer. Sigh. Next time I'll have to find a different place to hide the sweets, he murmured. Chapter 277. Asking about the Heavenly Palaces. It was a weekend morning. The Great Hall at Hogwarts buzzed with activity, but it wasn't the students' chatter that made the most noise. It was the beating of 1,000 owl wings. They streamed through the open windows, diving toward the 4 house tables. Parcels fell like raindrops, clattering onto benches, chairs, and the heads of a few unlucky pupils. There were copies of the Daily Prophet and the Wizarding Weekly, sweets and snacks from home, and several absurdly large packages whose contents were anyone's guess. Lynn and his friends entered the hall just then. Edgar walked ahead, talking animatedly to the others, totally oblivious to a parcel hurtling toward him. "Look behind you," Lynn warned. "What?" Edgar turned instinctively. Thump! The parcel hit him square on the face and knocked him back 2 steps. He fumbled it off, rubbing the reddened bridge of his nose, blinking at the parcel in his hands with a dazed expression. Lynn and the others passed him by without a second glance. "Doesn't anyone care that I just got hit?" Edgar demanded. "As long as you're alive," Lynn replied without looking back. They took their usual seats. House elves had already set out breakfast: steaming toast, fried eggs, bacon, sausages, and a large pot of pumpkin juice. Edgar tore open the parcel that had struck him and pulled out 2 newspapers, the Wizarding Weekly and the Daily Prophet. He skimmed the Wizarding Weekly, then reached for the Daily Prophet and grinned after a single glance. "Lynn," he said, handing it over, "you have to see this." "What is it?" Lynn took the paper and looked. Even though some time had passed since the second task, the story still dominated the front page. People seemed to find new angles to retell the great battle at the bottom of the lake every day. The front page photograph this time was of Lynn fighting the blue-ringed giant demon octopus. The shot was perfect. Lynn suspended in the water, his wand pointed forward. The octopus opposite him was blackened and singed, tentacles torn away, looking utterly defeated. The composition and lighting were cinematic. Anyone who didn't know better would have assumed it was a still from a fantasy blockbuster. Below the picture ran a dramatic headline: "Slaughter at the Lake Bottom. Azkaban champion single-handedly slays deep-sea beast." Lynn's mouth twitched as he read. The write-up was nothing new, just sensationalized retelling, full of phrases like earth-shattering thunder, blades of fire that burn all, and 7 giant hands ripping the beast apart. It read like myth. What surprised him more was the item printed beneath the photo. Maybe the image was so striking, or maybe Lynn had made the kill look too easy, but a previously obscure trend had suddenly become popular. The blue-ringed giant demon octopus, native to the Western Pacific and Indian Oceans, ministry classification XXXX, danger comparable to a dragon and strictly prohibited for private ownership, had become a craze among thrill-seeking wizards. The ministry's Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures had received hundreds of reports in the last week about illegally kept specimens. Some had dug enormous pools at home, others raised cubs in backyard ponds, and some even tried to buy adults on the black market. As a result, the ministry issued a special announcement printed in bold directly below the photo. Joint statement from George Smith, head of the Beast Division of the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, and Edward Burns, head of the International Magical Legal Office at the Department of International Magical Cooperation. Lynn skimmed it, a reminder of the creature's dangers, a warning that illegal keeping would be harshly punished, and a plea not to follow the fad. He almost skipped it, then did a double take at the name Edward Burns. He looked across the table at Edgar. "When did your dad get promoted?" Lynn asked. Edgar, spreading jam on his bread, glanced at the paper and flashed a proud grin. "He told me a few days ago," he said. "He said when I graduate, he'll get me a job at the ministry, too." I thought he was joking. Lynn fell silent for a moment. Edgar's face was alight with the kind of pride that comes from having an official for a parent. William, pushing his glasses up, murmured, Head of the International Magical Legal Office isn't a small post. If your dad really does arrange something for you, don't embarrass Hufflepuff. Edgar waved him off confidently. Don't worry, I'll do fine. For once, Ollie spoke up in a level voice. You even copied my history of magic homework. Edgar's smile froze. Lynn chuckled, reminded of an odd line that suddenly popped into his head. Asking about the Heavenly Palace. Lynn, what are you laughing at? Edgar asked. Nothing. I just remembered my dad's going to have a second child, Lynn said, waving it off and kept scanning the paper. Edgar eyed him suspiciously, but didn't pry. Lynn said strange things sometimes, and they were used to it. Lynn turned to the second page. He skimmed the headlines and was about to turn the page. Something in a small corner stopped him. A name printed in a tight black box. Barty Crouch, death. Lynn blinked. Barty Crouch. He hadn't heard that name in months. He hadn't expected the next time it came up to be an obituary. He certainly hadn't expected the ministry to put out an obituary for a Death Eater. He read on. The notice itself was brief, formulaic phrases about the years lived, but the resume that followed was long and imposing. Barty Crouch, former head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, former head of the Department of International Magical Cooperation, member of the Wizengamot, recipient of the Order of Merlin, first class. Lynn read through it and fell quiet. He'd been thinking of the wrong Crouch at first. The obituary was for old Barty, not Barty Crouch Jr. Lynn didn't have much to do with old Barty, not beyond one incident. He remembered the night he'd helped the man sober up, 2 applications of the Cruciatus, a legilimency, and a powerful memory charm. The treatment had been thorough. After that, old Barty had never again been plagued by Imperius. Of course, he hadn't returned to normal public life either. He stared at the small black and white photograph in the paper, the man's face stern and formal, nothing like the twisted mask he'd made of him during that night. The obituary concluded by saying the funeral would be held next week. Lynn's eyes brightened. Of course, Barty Crouch Jr., the son, would attend his father's funeral. After all, old Barty had once gone so far as to replace his wife with his son to save him, proof, if nothing else, of the strength of their relationship. The funeral was on the weekend. Lynn's lips curved into a grin as he began inwardly to plan which spell he'd try out when he met Barty Crouch Jr. Chapter 278. Even the most meticulous plans can have flaws. The Crouch family manor, an ancient house hidden in the wilds, lay wrapped in a deathly silence. The smell of decay seeped from every crack in the walls, mingling with years of dust and mildew to create a suffocating gloom. The great hall was unlit. Only the green flames in the fireplace danced, casting a ghostly glow over the room. At the head of the long table sat an infant. His skin was a sickly, dark red, as if the outer layer had been stripped away to reveal raw muscle beneath. His head was bald and veined, his nose reduced to 2 thin slits, his lips barely visible over 2 rows of jagged teeth. It was Lord Voldemort, in his infant state. He sat upright in a high-backed chair made for him, velvet cushions hoisted so his small body barely reached the table. His fingers tapped lightly on the armrest, a steady tap-tap in the hush. Below him, a dozen Death Eaters lay prostrate, cloaked in black with hoods drawn so their faces were lost in shadow. Only the soft sound of suppressed breathing and the occasional nervous swallow broke the silence. No one dared to look up. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. Voldemort's scarlet eyes swept slowly over them, emotionless, pausing briefly on certain figures. Then he spoke, a hoarse, metallic voice that scraped through the empty hall. In the time I have been away, how has the plan progressed? His gaze settled on the position to his right. Barty Crouch Jr. was prostrate lower than the others, forehead almost touching the floor. His voice came muffled and edged with unmistakable nerves. Respected Master, there has been a slight hitch in the plan. Voldemort's fingers stopped. The hall dropped into a heavier silence. Even the prostrate Death Eaters seemed to hold their breath, afraid any sound might earn notice. A hitch? Voldemort said. It is still within control, is it not? Barty hurried on. Master, please believe me, everything is under control. Voldemort did not answer at once, only watched him. After several long seconds, he finally asked, What hitch? Barty drew a breath. Master, that former student of yours, for some reason, he was also chosen by the Goblet of Fire. Voldemort's eyes narrowed. Lynn? Yes, Barty whispered, voice lower still. He seems to have exposed my disguise. I had to abandon the moody identity and shift to a more covert guise to continue my work. He waited, head bowed for Voldemort's reaction. The hall was silent, but for the green flames, Voldemort let out a short, cold laugh. Lynn, just a talented little wizard. Before true power, such petty tricks are irrelevant. Relieved by the lack of displeasure, Barty pressed on. There is another matter, Master. What is it? The Daily Prophet has published news of Barty Crouch's death. Barty said, the funeral will be held at the Ministry of Magic in 3 days. Voldemort's eyes narrowed. Barty Crouch, do you plan to attend your father's funeral? Barty made himself prostrate even deeper. Master, I have no father. His voice took on a near-manic fervor. I have only one master, and that is you. Voldemort said nothing, waiting for him to continue. I do not wish to attend the funeral as Barty. Barty's words rushed out. Since announcing your return at the Quidditch World Cup failed, why not use this occasion? Every ministry official will attend. Those arrogant, foolish officials, the traitors who opposed you, the ants who once disrespected you, they will all be gathered. The scale and influence will be enormous. If we announce your return to the world on such an occasion, he slammed his forehead to the floor. It would be a more shocking proclamation than the World Cup. Silence again. Voldemort tapped once, twice, slow and deliberate on the armrest. You have thought this through, Crouch, he said finally. His voice was still cold, but there was a trace of approval. Proceed as you proposed. Barty trembled, this time with ecstasy. Thank you, Master. Thank you for your trust. I will not disappoint you. I will. Withdraw. Voldemort cut him off. Barty fell silent, shuffled backwards while still prostrate, then rose and retreated into the shadows with his head bowed. Voldemort's gaze swept over the other figures once more. The hall fell into that same oppressive quiet. Only the green flames burned on. Elsewhere, in the Hogwarts Great Hall, it was lunchtime. The 4 house tables groaned with steaming food, students clustered in 2s and 3s, voices buzzing and cutlery clinking into a lively din. At the staff table, the professors were also eating. Professor Moody limped to his seat and sat, adjusting his wooden leg before pulling a small pouch from his robes and setting it on the table. Vials and tiny jars glittered in the light. From the pouch, he withdrew a small, transparent vial about the size of a thumb, full of a clear liquid. He uncorked it and let a drop fall onto the roast potato on his plate. Nothing changed. He added another drop to his pumpkin juice. Still nothing. The liquid was a poison detection reagent Moody had devised, said to turn deep purple at the faintest trace of any known poison. He watched for a moment, satisfied that the color did not deepen, and put the bottle away. But he did not immediately eat. He drew a small knife from his waist, small, but with a razor edge, and made a light cut on his finger. A tiny bead of blood welled up. He dabbed that drop onto his fork, then another onto the rim of his plate. He put the knife down, drew his wand, and cast a discreet checking spell. A narrow beam of light touched the blood-stained cutlery and plate. The droplets showed no abnormal reaction, no bubbling, no discoloration, no hissing smoke. There was no curse in the food. Satisfied, Moody nodded, speared a piece of roast potato, and ate. From the Hufflepuff table, Lynn watched the whole procedure out of the corner of his eye as he slowly cut at his own steak. He nearly laughed. Moody had missed a simple possibility. Who said a curse must be in the food or on the cutlery? When most students had left after lunch, Lynn got up and wandered across the empty tables to the staff end. He stopped at Moody's seat. On the cushion lay a few short, gray-white hairs. He leaned in and picked them up. There were a dozen. Polyjuice Potion required a piece of the target. Hair was the most convenient. With these, Lynn could transform into Moody's likeness. As for why he wanted to turn into Moody, the reason was simple. He planned to cause trouble at the funeral this weekend. He couldn't attend as himself. He still cared about his reputation. And if he went as himself, Barty might spot him and flee immediately. That would ruin the fun. He needed a new identity. Chapter 279. VIP position. Beep, 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 beep. After a burst of insistent alarm, Lynn blinked awake. He swung his legs out of bed and peered at the window. The sky was a sheet of gray and rain tapped steadily against the glass. I'd stay in bed if I could, he thought, but he hauled himself up anyway. He crossed to the trunk in the corner. the undetectable extension he'd installed, and climbed inside. The interior was as bright and spacious as ever. Dudu was there, sorting materials. He gave a small bow when Lynn entered. Lynn waved him over and headed straight for the potion shelf. Rows of bottles and jars lined the shelves, everything he'd brewed over the years, from simple healing draughts to elaborate poisons. He found what he needed, a bottle of polyjuice potion. The pale gold liquid shimmered. It was a fresh, high-quality brew with steady effects. Lynn pulled a dozen grayish-white hairs from his pocket, chose a good one, and dropped it into the potion. The liquid churned, shifting from pale gold through muddy yellow to a thick, sludgy brown. He uncorked the bottle and swallowed it all in one gulp. "Home-brewed potions still taste better," he muttered to his reflection. "Snape doesn't know a damn thing about potions." A burning heat rose from his stomach and spread through his limbs and bones. In the mirror, his face began to change, features shifting, skin puckering, hair bleaching from black to grayish-white. Scars crept over one eye. His wooden leg pulsed as if something were growing inside it. Moments later, the man in the mirror was Alastor Moody, a scarred, grizzled face, short gray-white hair, that single vigilant eye, and beneath the gruff exterior, a sparkle of youthful mischief that Lynn couldn't entirely suppress. He nodded in satisfaction. To complete the illusion, he'd made a magical eye overnight. It wasn't perfect. The real Mad Eye's eye could rotate a full 360 degrees and see through most concealments. His imitation was a little crude, the replication incomplete. Still, when it spun, it looked the part. He stretched his neck to get used to the new frame, took a few practice steps with an exaggerated limp, and found he could manage despite the awkward balance. "Do." His voice came out hoarse and rough, exactly like Moody's. "Let's go to the Ministry of Magic." Dudu's eyes widened. "Master, you're very ugly," he blurted, then grabbed the corner of Lynn's robes. With a soft pop, they vanished from the trunk. The next second, Lynn's boots hit the marble floor of the ministry atrium. The golden fountain still sprayed in the center. The statues of the magical brethren gleamed, and the lifts behind the grills hummed as they shuttled between floors. Because it was the weekend, the place wasn't packed with the usual traffic of officials, clerks, and visitors. The atrium had only a scattering of people hurrying across the hall, but a steady stream of ministry staff in uniform were moving in one direction with grave expressions. Pairs and small groups passed Lynn, faces drawn and tight. Old Barty was clearly popular, Lynn thought, so many people coming to see him off. Nearby, two young wizards complained in low voices as they walked past. A funeral on a weekend. What a hassle. "I know, right? They even demanded everyone not on duty be present. I was supposed to go to Hogsmeade with my girlfriend." "Lucky you. I was going to a Quidditch match." Lynn huffed inwardly and forced himself to adopt Moody's swagger, an awkward, limping gait, his wooden leg thumping thump-thump against the marble. People steered clear. Mad-Eye Moody's reputation did him a favor, fewer interruptions than if he'd posed as some well-liked official. The great hall had been draped in black. Silver candlelight trembled among the hangings, and a huge silver Crouch family crest hung on the wall. The hall could hold over 1,000 people, and many had come. Front rows were filled with ministry heads and senior officials. Further back, delegations from other countries stood in stiff, formal robes. Pure-blood families were represented, Nott, Parkinson, Shafiq, and Lynn spotted Lucius Malfoy speaking in hushed tones with the head of House Macmillan. A low, watery dirge filled the room. It had the mournful quality of merpeople singing. Lynn slipped into an inconspicuous corner, leaning on his staff, and started the magical eye spinning, scanning the crowd with a full-circle sweep. It spun and spun. One sweep, nothing. Two sweeps, nothing. Three sweeps, still nothing. He frowned. No sign of Barty Crouch Jr.? Was this kid actually not coming to the funeral for his own father? Lynn felt a twinge of disappointment. Maybe the whole trip was a waste. Distinguished guests. Cornelius Fudge's voice carried across the hall from the podium. He stood in solemn black robes, expression grave, and read the eulogy through the amplification. "Today we gather to bid farewell to our colleague, our loyal partner, a man who dedicated his life to the ministry of magic, Mr. Barty Crouch." Lynn's thoughts drifted. Fudge's speech would be full of the usual platitudes, diligent and conscientious, served the ministry faithfully, a loss to the wizarding community. He leaned against the wall to avoid listening. Fudge finished and announced, "Guests, please come forward and pay your respects to the casket." Fudge himself stepped forward with a small floral tribute taken from a plump attendant by his side. He walked slowly to the oaken casket in the center of the hall. It was decorated with silver filigree and surrounded by flowers, dimly lit by candlelight. He stopped before it, drew a breath, and bent to bow. Bang! The casket lid exploded upward, wood splintering and flowers scattering. A shockwave rippled through the room, whipping the black hangings. The front rows stumbled back, gasps and cries filling the air. Lynn's magical eye locked onto the source of the blast. In the dust and splinters, someone vaulted out of the wreckage. Tattered black robes, a wand raised high, a wild grin on his face. Lynn's pupils narrowed. Barty Crouch Jr. No, he'd taken on Moody's appearance too. Of course, no wonder the boy hadn't shown up in plain sight. He'd chosen the most visible seat in the room, inside the coffin. Moody stood atop the broken casket, wand held aloft, the grin manic, his magical eye sweeping the hall. Then that eye stopped. It trained directly on Lynn. Lynn's own magical eye froze in its socket. They looked at each other. The great hall went instantly, utterly silent. Lynn sighed inwardly. This was trouble. He had planned to act in secret, not to end up with two Moody's facing off in the middle of the great hall. He slowly raised his cane, the wand sliding out from within, and gripped it in his hand. The Moody on the sarcophagus did the same, wand in hand. The two Moody's squared off across the ruined stone. Hundreds of guests in the great hall stared, stunned. Fudge stood with his mouth open, his own wand still clutched in his hand, frozen in a portrait of confusion and terror. No one could say who screamed first. Then the room erupted. Screams, gasps, the crash of overturned chairs. Those up front shoved backward in a panic. Those in the back surged for the doors. Lynn had no time to worry about them. He raised his wand and fired a corrosion curse at the Moody on the sarcophagus. That Moody reacted instantly, leaning aside so the curse grazed his ear and struck a pillar, making a grinding, corrosive sound. But his counterattack was even crueler. From the tip of his wand, a green light shot toward Lynn's face. Lynn flicked his wand upward, and at the same time, the stone floor at his feet bulged. An earthen wall rose up, a thick barrier between him and the killing curse. The curse slammed into it with a thunderous impact, blasting a shallow pit but failing to break through. Lynn pointed his wand again. The wall began to tremble, then shot up so fast it nearly reached the great hall's ceiling, a massive rampart grinding across the floor toward the other Moody. The wall didn't move fast, but it was inexorable. As it advanced, it plowed furrows through the stone, splintered chairs into kindling, and knocked over anyone who couldn't get out of the way, carrying them along. The Moody opposite waved his wand again and again. Explosion charms detonated against the earthen bulwark in rapid succession, sending showers of debris and clouds of dust into the air, but they only scarred the wall. Its steady advance didn't slow. The smile finally fell from the other Moody's face. Lynn's lips curved slightly. He had him where he wanted. Then, without warning, a green light struck from behind. Lynn's Peter's jolt screamed a warning. He cut the earthen wall's support at once and lunged sideways. The killing curse whooshed past, nearly grazing his back before slamming into and obliterating a row of seats. Lynn rolled twice, sprang up, and looked back. A figure in black robes stood there, wand raised and a Death Eater mask covering his face. Not a single figure. From the corners of the great hall, more figures in black slipped out of the chaos. They tore off guest robes to reveal dark cloaks and silver masks beneath. 1, 2, 3, 4. In moments, more than a dozen Death Eaters stood amid the crowd. "Long live the Dark Lord," someone shouted. Spells erupted from all sides. Green, red, and blue lights braided through the air, some striking at guests, some at ministry officials, and several bearing straight toward Lynn. He dodged, glanced back at the earthen wall, and saw that without his magical support, it buckled and collapsed almost instantly. Dust and rubble rained down. The Moody on the sarcophagus leaped down into the fray, wand held high, a mad grin on his scarred face. "For the Dark Lord, for Lord Voldemort," the Death Eaters cried, and their spells intensified. The scene tore out of control. Guests screamed, scattered, and trampled one another. Some were struck by hexes and fell shrieking. Others were hit by falling masonry and bled. Attempts to apparate failed, the anti-apparition wards were still in place, and people slammed uselessly into the invisible barrier. Auror reinforcements finally burst in. "Which one is Moody? Which one is Moody?" They shouted, raising their wands only to freeze in bewilderment. Two Moodies, one on the left, his face a lattice of scars, his magical eye whirring, the other on the right, the same. Both raised their wands and in perfect unison cried, "That one is a fake! I am the real one!" The Aurors looked at one another, flummoxed. "Which is the real one?" "How should I know? They look exactly the same. Professor Moody has a magical eye. Wait, they both do." Then the Moody on the left fired a killing curse at the one on the right. The right dodged and replied with an explosion charm. The blast between them knocked several Aurors off their feet. The two Moodies launched into full combat, curses and counter-curses painting the air green and red in a blur. One summoned a jet of water, the other unleashed fiend fire. One practiced curses, the other fired killing curses. They tore through the center of the great hall, over the head table, along the walls, leaving wreckage in their wake. The Aurors kept their wands trained but hesitated. "Which one is the real one?" "I don't know. Shall we hit them both? What if we kill the real one?" "All of you shut up," snapped a lead Auror. "Catch the masked ones first. Let the Moodies fight it out for now. How many guests have died already? If the real Moody falls, it'll be for a cause." They moved at once to seize the masked Death Eaters. In the crush, one familiar figure shoved his way out, Lucius Malfoy, pale as death, sweat beading on his forehead, his wand shaking in his hand. He forced through the crowd toward the doors. "Move! Out of my way!" His voice cracked. "Damn it! The Death Eaters have started their show without telling me," he thought, and bolted through the exit like a hound after treasure. In the great hall's center, the two Moodies kept demolishing each other. Lynn's wand flicked relentlessly, fiendfire, venom, explosion charms in succession. The other Moody's skin was a ruin, burnt and charred, short gray hair singed to the scalp, robes shredded, deep wounds exposing bone. The fake magical eye had been torn away and gone, leaving only a bloody socket. Still Lynn pressed the attack. Another corrosion curse nicked the scarred shoulder, carving a groove to the collarbone. The man staggered and gasped. He was terrifyingly strong, stronger than any Moody they'd seen, and yet for some reason he wouldn't finish the job. Every spell seemed carefully aimed not to deliver a mortal blow, as though he were being prolonged for some other purpose. "Avada Kedavra!" a green light hissed. Lynn raised a slab of rubble to take the blow. It shattered, but protected him. Then he pointed his wand and casually fired a bone-breaking curse. The other Moody's supporting leg gave way. He crashed to the floor and lay on his back, head tilted up, the remaining eye fixed on Lynn. "Avada!" Before the incantation could finish, an invisible blade sliced through the air. The other Moody's wand hand was cleanly severed at the wrist. The detached hand, clenching the wand, rolled twice and stilled. Blood spurted and painted the floor. The wounded man screamed. He curled in on himself, clamping the stump with his free hand, but the blood would not be stopped. He looked up, his bloodshot eye locked on Lynn, his voice raw. "Who are you really? You are not Moody." Lynn tilted his head, parried a stray hex, and met the exhausted, bleeding man's gaze. "You don't need to know." He raised his wand, aimed at the man's chest, and said simply, "Defendo." When Moody died, the battle in the Great Hall quickly collapsed. The Death Eaters, many coerced into action by Voldemort's threats, had no stomach for continuing once their apparent leader fell. They fled. The Aurors pressed the advantage, spells flying, to knock the masked figures down one by one. Some tried to apparat, but only slammed into the invisible barrier and were pinned down. Others resisted briefly, but were quickly overwhelmed and disarmed. A few tried hiding in the crowd, but the guests had been evacuated to safety long before. There was nowhere to blend in. 10 minutes later, the last Death Eater lay bound on the flagstones, the great hall ringing with silence. The place was a ruin, broken chairs, toppled pillars, scattered rubble, and dark bloodstains. The air stung with smoke and iron. A dozen Death Eaters were tied in a line, groaning. Their masks off, their faces pale beneath. The Aurors had paid dearly. At least 5 were dead, sprawled in pools of blood. 7 or 8 were gravely wounded and being hurried off for aid. Nearly everyone else was hurt to some degree. The lead Auror sucked in a breath and then remembered. "Where is Professor Moody?" he shouted. The Aurors spread out, searching the wreckage. Soon someone called, "Over here!" They gathered around a single body. It lay charred and unrecognizable. Skin burned, short gray hair blackened, one eye only a bloody hole, the severed wrist gruesome. No patch of intact skin remained, the corpse barely read as human. Is this Professor Moody?" someone whispered. "I don't know," another answered. "Where's the other one?" "Not found." They knelt to examine the body more closely. Then, abruptly, the corpse began to change. The scorched, warped features smoothed and blurred. The gray hair darkened and lengthened to a deep brown. Scarred skin softened, and the face shifted until it was no longer the scarred, burned Moody, but a different man entirely. Within seconds, the figure on the floor had become a middle-aged wizard. Sunken eyes, tall and thin, deep brown hair, no scars on his face, robes torn and blood seeping from the severed wrist. The Aurors stared, stunned. One bent in for a closer look and choked out, "This is..." His voice caught. "Barty Crouch Jr., an older Auror finally managed. "That Death Eater who died over a decade ago. Wasn't he dead? He died in Azkaban, supposedly of illness. Then how is he alive again?" They looked at one another in speechless shock. After several seconds, the lead Auror forced out, voice raw with confusion and fatigue. "Then, what about the Moody we saw alive just now?"